Good morning. This is David French in Washington. As you can see, it's a snowy day in the nation's capital, but the weather will not hold up the swearing in of President Reagan and Vice President Bush for their second terms. Our correspondent Frank Sesno has been at the White House all morning, and we'll be seeing him in just a second. It is 10 degrees in Washington. The winds are from the west-northwest at a steady 23, gusting to 43, and the wind chill factor in the nation's capital is 25 degrees. Frank, you're out in it. We'll ask how the mood is inside, because we know how it is outside.
Well, inside, the family is there, and the president and vice president will shortly, as you were saying, be taking the oath of office. The reason they're taking the oath of office today, as we've said, the 20th Amendment to the Constitution, which declares that the president's and vice president's term expires at noon on the 20th of January. So Sunday is the day, this year anyway, that the official oath of office is administered. Tomorrow, as we've been saying, the grand parade, the grand old party's big party takes place.
Frank, as you know, the president was disappointed in having to cancel this evening's event, this early evening's event for the young people, but he felt, he said so strongly about their welfare and well-being that it would be wisest to do that. There have been, by the way, 14 overnight guests in the White House, the close families of the president and the first lady. And for this ceremony, which we're about to see, there will be 96 witnesses to the swearing in, the formal swearing in, and there will be 178 going to a reception afterwards. We are now live at the site of the swearings in, and of course Vice President Bush will be sworn in first by his old friend of some 2 decades, Justice Potter Stewart, and then Chief Justice Warren Burger will swear in the president. There will be an invocation by the Reverend Mumma, the president's California pastor. Frank, what else can you tell us about the comings and goings in this ceremonial weekend leading up to today's formal event?
Well, taking today first, David, the president ventured out in this lovely weather we're having here in Washington. Cold is certainly an understatement if you're describing it. He went to church, went to the National Cathedral for a national Thanksgiving, is what we're told. We're told the president called the whole ceremony impressive. Mrs. Reagan's comment was, "It's cold." We presume that was not referring to the ceremony, but the weather.
We're seeing him now on videotape, Frank, as he arrived at the National Cathedral.
As you know, David, the president has been reluctant to venture out to church very much during his term in office, citing security reasons, saying that his presence disrupts and, in fact, jeopardizes many of the other churchgoers. So what we saw today was a somewhat unusual occurrence. The president, in fact, will be going to church again tomorrow.
Well, the guests have been directed to their chairs at the grand foyer, which we saw just a moment ago, and there on that landing, the swearings in will occur with Chief Justice and Mrs. Burger and Justice and Mrs. Potter Stewart. Now in the yellow oval room, they'll come into the state floor by elevator and go to their chairs right there in the front row. I believe, Frank, and correct me if I'm wrong, that only 6 presidents in history have had their inaugural day, the fall on a Sunday, and I believe only 4 of them have opted to do it this way. Eisenhower was the last one to choose to have the private Sunday swearing in and then the public one on Monday the next day. But it's the 20th Amendment to the Constitution which requires that the swearing in be on the 20th. And even so, Frank, isn't it up to the option of the president to pretty much decide whether he wants to do it this way or only on Monday?
Well, he has to do it according to the Constitution on the 20th, as I understand it, but he does not have to have anything on the Monday. In this particular case, of course, it becomes a national holiday of sorts, as the president has the ceremonial swearing in up on the Capitol Hill, and of course the inaugural parade. One thing worth noting, however, with this weather, there has been some discussion, unofficial discussion, of bringing tomorrow's ceremony, that is the ceremonial ceremony, if you will, inside. However, White House officials say at this time there are no plans for that. The president will brave the elements, at least that's how we have it right now. But it is indeed very, very cold, and if it should get a whole lot colder, if there should be snow or something, it could be held inside. Other presidents have done that. The reviewing stand for tomorrow's parade is not only heated but bulletproof, so the president, come what may, can be expected to be in the reviewing stand.
Well, there's a lot of pressure and precedent for going through with things as they are planned, going through with them outdoors, and going through with the entire parade. We recall John Kennedy staying till 6 p.m. to wait for his parade to finally finish. Those parades, which are planned with great precision, rarely get off with such precision. Indeed, there are some 63 floats and all those marching units and everything.
And each parade, David, each parade assumes, if you will, the personality of the president and the tempo of the times. Franklin Roosevelt, during World War II, we saw Pennsylvania Avenue lined with tanks. Ronald Reagan, being a grand horseman, had a few hundred horses in his first inaugural. In this inaugural parade, we're told there will be more than 700 of them.
Well, the president was awakened this morning, by the way, Frank, at 7:30 by the White House operator, and he and Mrs. Reagan were brought breakfast on trays. This is for all those people who like to take careful notes on history. They had juice, soft-boiled eggs, whole wheat toast with honey, no butter, and the coffee was decaffeinated. It's going to be rather a long day for the president, so to have decaffeinated coffee perhaps in itself is brave. Now descending the main staircase at the White House, the president and Mrs. Reagan, as the grand foyer audience rises in greeting. So the president and Mrs. Reagan, the vice president and Mrs. Bush, proceeding down that grand staircase to their seats here in the front row. The next event on the schedule is to be the invocation by the Reverend Don D. Mumma of California.
Mr. President, Mrs. Reagan, Mr. Vice President, Mrs. Bush, it's with great joy that I assure you on good authority that across our nation, right at this very moment, there are hundreds and yea, thousands of believers who are joining us in this moment of solemn commitment as they, on this Sunday morning, pray for you and this new administration. Let us join them in prayer now. Let us pray. Our Heavenly Father, we invoke your blessing on this very solemn occasion. We pray that this may be more than a formality. We pray, O God, for all of us here and around our country, that this may be a splendid new time of commitment and dedication. O God, we pray that you will, in particular, fill Mr. Reagan and Mr. Bush with a new sense of their divine appointment and a new sense of your Holy Spirit within their lives, that they may know that they have been called by you. Oh God, our prayer is that your ways may be their ways and your thoughts may be their thoughts, and they may live to the praise of your glory. This we pray, our Father, in the humble name of Jesus. Amen. Amen.
The Reverend Mumma, the president's pastor while in California. Now Vice President Bush and Mrs. Bush and Justice Potter Stewart proceed for the swearing in of the Vice President, which precedes by just moments the swearing in of the President.
Following, repeat after me. I, George Herbert Walker Bush,
I, George Herbert Walker Bush,
do solemnly swear
do solemnly swear
that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States
that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States
against all enemies, foreign and domestic,
against all enemies, foreign and domestic,
that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same,
that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same,
that I take this obligation freely,
that I take this obligation freely,
without any mental reservation
without any mental reservation
or purpose of evasion,
or purpose of evasion,
and that I will well and faithfully discharge
and that I will well and faithfully discharge
the duties of the office
on which I am about to enter.
So help you God.
So help me God.
Congratulations.
Thank you, sir.
The Potter Stewarts and the Bushes have been the closest of friends for some 20 years. They sometimes vacation together at the Vice President's main residence, and the Vice President selected his old friend to do the swearing in. Actually, anyone in the United States legally entitled to hear an oath may do these swearing-in ceremonies. This will be the fifth time, though, that Chief Justice Warren Burger has administered the oath to a President of the United States.
Place your left hand on the Bible and raise your right hand and repeat after me. I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute
the
office of President of the United States
the office of President of the United States
and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend
the
Constitution of the United States. So help me God.
So help me God.
My congratulations, sir.
So for the 50th time in the history of the nation, those 35 words pledging loyalty and fealty to leadership for another 4 years. An obviously happy and composed President and Mrs. Reagan. This, of course, will be repeated with more ceremony tomorrow outside the Capitol. United States Army Chorus now, My Country 'Tis of Thee. Now the Reverend Mumma will be giving the benediction, concluding the ceremony.
And keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May the Lord lift up the light of his countenance upon you and give you and us peace, now and forevermore. Amen. God bless you.
So the President of the United States is still the President of the United States and Vice President Bush for another 4 years. The official duties, fulfilling the requirements of the 20th Amendment, now having been concluded. The two couples now are going for a photo opportunity, which is precisely scheduled for 12:07. And then there will be a reception for the people you see around the president now and additional ones, other more distant members of the family, both blood relatives and official family. And they're going out in the cold for this. And I see that the women remained inside. As we reported at the beginning of this event, the official temperature at Washington National Airport is 10 degrees with the wind blowing at 23 miles per hour and a wind chill factor, perhaps not right where they are, but of about 25 below zero to the exposed portions of the skin. The president and George Bush smiling, waving to the photographers and those who have to be outside, and going rather quickly back inside. As you see now, the White House with its fountain on an historic day in history. This is David French in Washington for White House correspondent Frank Sesno. The News Channel will return right after this.
Turn to CNN's 10 o'clock evening news reporting. Follow important events around the globe.
NBC News presidential inauguration coverage is being sponsored in part by Ford and your local Ford dealer. Have you driven a Ford lately? By the Sun Company, where there's sun, there's energy. And by AT&T, we're reaching out in new directions.
Good morning, all. I'm Tom Brokaw, NBC News in Washington, here with John Chancellor and the entire NBC News team. And welcome to your nation's capital, where politicians have been reminded once again that for all of their power and authority, all of their celebrity and ceremony, nature prevails. And on this day, nature has delivered to the capital city temperatures hovering right now at 0 degrees. That means a wind chill factor of 14 degrees below zero, and that has radically altered the inaugural ceremonies that were scheduled for today, the public ceremonies at the Capitol and at the White House. The parade has been canceled, and the inaugural ceremonies that were scheduled for the west front of the Capitol now have been moved inside to the rotunda.
Tom, Albert Einstein once said that mathematics is all well and good, but every once in a while nature just leads you around by the nose.
President Reagan, at 73 years and 349 days, is not only the oldest president, but he's about to be the coldest president on his public inaugural day as well. He has been sworn in, of course. That occurred yesterday in simple but elegant ceremonies at the White House. The president and the vice president sworn in on the constitutionally approved day of January 20th. This was the day for public celebration, and as I say, those celebrations now have been altered slightly. We are going to go to Bob Hager, who is on Pennsylvania Avenue, to give you an idea of just how cold it is and how
These grandstands will be empty today. There'll be no parade, no bands marching by. And for young musicians from around the country who traveled hundreds of miles and raised thousands of dollars to pay their own way here, it's a disappointment as bitter as the temperatures. For most of yesterday, the wind howled and the snow blew. Temperatures dropped to 0. A band from Hacienda Heights, California tried to ignore the weather at a final practice. But by evening time, inaugural chairman Ron Walker called all band leaders together to announce the oath-taking would be moved inside and the parade called off. He said he thought he'd planned for almost every contingency.
I thought we were able to do that, with the exception of the weather, and that's the Lord's way of letting us know he's still in charge.
Groups like the Robert E. Lee High School Band from Midland, Texas, have been preparing for this day for months, hoping to be selected to come to Washington. Last month, when they heard they had been chosen, the students were overjoyed.
Presidential Inaugural Committee.
To pay for its trip, the band had to raise $170,000. They did it in less than 3 weeks, selling turkeys and hams and accepting donations from proud Midland citizens. Last night, when they returned to their hotel in the Washington, D.C. suburbs after dinner, band leader Randy Story called them together.
And they told us that President Reagan had decided that because of the weather that we would cancel the parade. You know, you still got to know that, you know, you were the band from the state of Texas. And the president just did not want anybody to be hurt.
A parent, Sandy Smith, who organized the fundraising drive.
You know what this trip meant to all of us. It didn't turn out quite like we meant for it to, but we'll take what's left and still keep our pride together, and let's do it just like we always do.
There's a reason for it. There's a reason for it, okay?
But elsewhere, students from another band suddenly decided last night to practice one more time. Practice for nothing, just to forget their disappointment.
Let's just do it, okay?
And as bad as they felt, practice they did. Most of the bands will now be invited to join the president at the Capitol Center, an indoor arena here, this afternoon. But for the youngsters, it won't be the same as parading their hometown colors down Pennsylvania Avenue. Robert Hager, NBC News on Pennsylvania Avenue.
Thanks, Robert. By the way, people who paid up to $100 a ticket for some of the select seats along Pennsylvania Avenue now will have their money refunded if they apply for a refund before February 10th. That's according to the official inaugural committee. The contractor, however, who bid on the seats at the public ceremonies in the west front of the White House deliberately underbid. That is, he built them for less than what it may cost him because he thought he was going to be able to sell sections of those inaugural stands to souvenir hunters. Whether or not he'll be able to get top dollar for those or not, we don't know. A lot has been scrambled on this very cold, bitter day in Washington, D.C. One thing has not changed. The president's press spokesman still is Larry Speaks, who hails from deep in Mississippi, and he's with Chris Wallace. Let's see how the two of them are getting along right now. How you doing out there?
Well, we're doing just fine, and in fact, it's so nice here right now, the sun beaming down, that Larry Speaks just said to me, you know, if we'd known it was going to be this comfortable, maybe we could have gone ahead. But the weather does kind of catch up on you, doesn't it?
That's true. I've been on here only a few minutes. I think some of the participants would have had to been out several hours, and we really had no choice. I think we would have had some frostbite and maybe some serious problems had we elected to stay outside.
You just accompanied the president and Mrs. Reagan over to church this morning. Do they have anything to say about the weather, which is becoming the big story of this inauguration?
Well, I think everybody has a little bit to say about the weather. I think the president was invigorated a bit by the briskness out here, but I think they're off and running and ready for a glorious day here.
How disappointed are they that the parade has been canceled and that the swearing-in has been moved indoors?
Well, I think they're disappointed, as is everybody, and they're really more disappointed for the participants in it and the people who had come a long way to participate in the parade, come a long way to see the historic swearing-in ceremony. So I think that was their main consideration when they thought about it.
Now, the president and Mrs. Reagan will go this afternoon to suburban Maryland to an event for the bands.
Yes, after the inaugural ceremony in the rotunda of the Capitol, they'll come back to the White House briefly.
This is not working.
Then helicopter out to the Capitol Center.
What do I do
Maryland,
when it says memorizing?
Where they will see the assembled bands, probably 12, 15, 16,000 parade participants there this afternoon. And they'll hear a little musical conclusion that would have taken place at the parade. And then the president will address them, thanking them for their participation and saying, maybe we'll do it again sometime.
Well, not another inaugural, I don't think, though.
Not right off the bat.
Is he going to go to all the balls tonight, or is the weather going to curtail that?
No, I think they'll go through their full schedule. Really, there's not much change. The inaugural ceremony will go on the same length, everything in it, except for the indoors and rather than outdoors. The parade, as we just mentioned, is different, but there are 10 balls tonight, and they'll make every one of them. I think they'll be home after midnight tonight.
Larry Speaks, thanks very much, and we're going to let you get in out of the cold. Tom?
Thank you very much. Chris Wallace at the White House today with Larry Speaks, who's the president's official spokesman. Just to bring you up to date, of course, the public inaugural ceremonies now outside the west front of the Capitol have been canceled for today. The swearing-in ceremony, the public version of that, and the president's speech will take place in the rotunda of the Capitol with a select invited few people. 140,000 folks altogether were expected to attend the outdoor inaugural ceremony, just the public side, because the president was sworn in privately yesterday. Now that has been reduced, and a lot of folks have spent a lot of money to come here from all over the country. They're going to be obviously disappointed as well, but an important thing to remember about this kind of weather. The city looks absolutely magnificent today, but when the wind chill is 14 degrees below zero, it is extremely dangerous out there. Frostbite and more serious injuries can happen in a hurry.
Well, you know, it looks pretty, but it is, as Tom says, it's dangerous. Some of those kids, and some of those kids we saw from Texas, were scheduled to be out at 4 a.m. this morning, beginning to get their bands in their costumes, and if you can imagine what 6 or 8 hours in this kind of cold would do to those kids, and think of the ones who have to play the brass instruments with the metal mouthpieces. How would you like to, in that cold? I mean, it just made no sense.
We don't want to make light of it, but they could have it permanently implanted on their lips if they were to go at that length.
It really was terrible here last night. It's nice today, but it was scary. And when you think of sending out just thousands of young kids in the dark, with that kind of wind blowing and that kind of cold, there was just no choice.
Right. John, we have the president videotape of him going to church this morning, just across from the White House, just across Lafayette Square, that is. It is called St. John's Church. It is traditionally called the Church of the Presidents because that is where they can very easily attend services, and it has been there for a long time. There, as you see, the president and his Secret Service detail assembled in the limousine, a very short drive, and that's the first look that we've had at Mrs. Reagan's inaugural day outfit designed by Adolfo. She says that she chose the color blue because all of the states on the NBC News map the night of the election turned up blue for President Reagan. And that's a very blue outfit indeed.
By those terms, she's very often a Democrat, Tom. She likes red.
That's right. The president, very briefly, appearing with Mrs. Reagan today as he emerged from St. John's Church just across from the White House. The Capitol Center will be the focus of our attention later this afternoon. That's where many of the marching units and the bands and the people who are going to participate in the parade will be putting on a show for the president and others later this afternoon between 2, 3, and 4 o'clock Eastern Time. They have been rearranging their schedules there as well. Jamie Gangale standing by now. Jamie?
Tom, not to be left out of the history books, we have a new piece of inaugural trivia for you. Since it seems to be freezing on President Reagan's parade outside, we're going to have the first inaugural parade ever held indoors. Well, almost. Actually, this is going to be a thank you, a command performance. It's being billed by President Reagan. But most of the people who would have been in the parade are going to be in the audience this afternoon watching. I don't know if you know this, but if they had gone outside today, it was so cold that many of their instruments would not have worked. In fact, I think the only performers who would not have minded today's weather would have been the Alaskan dog sled team. Unfortunately, we will not be seeing them inside this afternoon. It'll be a much shorter version with military bands, and then the big finale with the all-star band where performers were picked from all over the 50 states. So we'll be staying here and watching. Both Vice President Bush and President Reagan will be here at about 3 o'clock this afternoon. Tom?
Thanks, Jamie. And, of course, we'll have coverage throughout the day here of the Convention Center and all of the other activities that now have been rescheduled, including those public ceremonies in the rotunda of the Capitol later this afternoon. By the way, for history buffs, and there will be lots of new trivia after today, this is the first time since 1829 that the administration has been forced to move an inauguration indoors rather than outdoors, and that happened when Andrew Jackson, who was a tough old guy, decided that the weather was just too inclement when he was being inaugurated for the ceremonies to go on outdoors, so he moved them indoors.
Yeah, but you know, excuse me, when you're finished, there's a jinx. There is a jinx that on second inaugurals, and that was true of Jackson, that was true of Grant, that was true of Cleveland, although he served 2 separate terms, the weather was terrible. It was terrible on Roosevelt's second inaugural, buckets of rain. And people who like to associate jinxes and myths with the presidents will pick up on this one because the Reagan second inaugural had to be put inside.
Well, we'll keep track of that. We'll keep track of lots more history as well, because during the course of NBC News coverage today, we're going to be showing you inaugural moments. And John Dancy will be our reporter on those, and we'll be back with more on Inauguration 85 after this.
York City, 1789. Plagued by personal debt, George Washington had to borrow money to attend his own inaugural, held in Federal Hall, a former debtor's prison. The man who led his country in war was so nervous that his hand shook and his voice trembled as he read his inaugural address.
Back continuing the NBC coverage of Inauguration 1985, and the schedule, as you probably are very well aware now, has been changed a good deal as a result of the very cold weather that we have in Washington today. Temperature hovering around zero. That means that we have a wind chill factor of 14 degrees below zero. The inaugural ceremonies have been moved inside of the rotunda. That changes the security considerations. They had been expecting 140,000 people to attend the outdoor ceremonies, and they were going to put each of them through one of those metal detection devices, much like you have at an airport. So security considerations were going to be enormous today. They still are, of course. After all, this is the president who has been wounded in one assassination attempt, and the United States has been the target of terrorist attacks all around the world, including notably in Beirut, where the Marine headquarters was attacked. At any rate, the security considerations for this day now have been changed by the weather, and I have this report on all of the preparations that have taken place. For security people, the song is the same, but suddenly the lyrics are different. Preparations like this dress rehearsal for the swearing-in ceremony last week are now obsolete. Security plans for the inaugural parade were scrapped this morning, and the 3-inch thick bulletproof glass of the Capitol and the White House reviewing stand now becomes unnecessary. But the mission of security teams remains the same, to be sure that nothing happens to the president or any of the participants in today's inaugural events. Despite the change of plans, security at this 50th presidential inauguration remains a major concern. John Walker oversees the Secret Service.
It is more of a concern this year than in past years, and I think that's largely a function of the growth of terrorism, of incidents of terrorism in the world. Security generally is more of a concern today than it was 4 years ago.
This morning, the focus of security efforts is at the Capitol Rotunda, where the swearing-in will take place. And the Capitol Center, a sports arena outside of Washington where inaugural officials are planning an alternative to the parade. At both locations, the security you don't see will be just as important as the security you can see. You will see lots of police and concrete barricades on the streets. You will not see the FBI's elite hostage rescue team. It's called HURT, but they won't be far away. You won't recognize members of the military's crack Delta Force of highly trained commandos, but they'll be around the capital city as well. And the FBI has been assembling a computerized video library of important buildings, pictures which allow agents to know exactly what they are getting into if they need to enter a building.
As I proceed, I can tell exactly how far it is to each wall. Now, the distance to the men's room from this location is 22 feet.
In the last few days in this town, people interested in the inauguration needed passes just to get their inauguration passes. 5 dozen for all of the event locations. Now, those credentials become a sort of security souvenir, like this description of security from President Truman's inaugural in 1949.
The Secret Service car follows directly behind the president and a little to the left to keep anyone from passing the president's car, and if anything should be coming from the other direction, to scoot around the president's car and smash into it if necessary. The big open Cadillac is made of heavily reinforced steel, carries Tommy guns, tear gas, and all sorts of equipment.
Tommy guns.
Yeah, Robert McCormick, that was.
That was
one
Robert
of the,
McCormick.
Distinguished NBC News correspondents in Washington in those days.
You know, Tom, as a sign of the times, the General Services Administration now has an architect on its staff here in Washington designing what are called aesthetically pleasing planters that can be filled with dynamite that can stop a 9-ton truck at 30 miles an hour. In other words, security has now entered architecture.
Yeah, it's a sad commentary that terrorists are, at any large event these days, the unexpected, uninvited, and unseen visitor that everyone has to anticipate. Well, there's a lighter side to all of this as well. And to cover the lighter side is the Pearl Mesta of NBC News, Douglas Kiker, who has thrown his body into parties in sacrifice for his profession, all the way from San Francisco to Dallas and now to Washington, D.C. Ladies and gentlemen, America's guest, Douglas Kiker, talking about the glitz around this inauguration. Douglas?
Thank you, Tom.
4 years ago at Mr. Reagan's first inauguration, this VIP section behind me here looked like a mink farm. You never saw so many mink coats. Well, this inauguration, the second, is said to be a little more restrained, a little less glitzy. That may well be, but still, as you're going to see, it's pretty glitzy. Neither cold nor Super Bowl nor food galore can keep Ronald Reagan's well-heeled admirers from their appointed rounds. While this mounted honor guard prepared for a parade which will not happen, the glittering entertainment goes on. They have come by Lear and by limo.
That's Mr. and Mrs. John Rollins. And then my chauffeur, Seymour.
Seymour?
Joseph Seymour.
Oh.
S-E-Y-M-O-U.
Checked into the very best hotels.
Got a big night ahead of you?
Yes.
Big weekend, huh?
And they are determined to have a good time.
I feel like Cinderella going
You are Cinderella going to the ball.
Prince Charming.
I bet it's warmer up in
New Jersey. I bet it is.
The question is, what is a wind chill factor?
Sure, the bitter cold is a minor inconvenience.
I in a way wish they didn't cancel it.
Then you wouldn't have to make a decision about whether you're going or not.
Did you hear? They expect it to be 5 above.
But this weekend is theirs to be savored.
Fly me to the moon, let me play up there with those stars.
Remember Cinderella?
$1,000 plate, we heard that.
Well, here she is at a party. And Prince Charming? Well, what else on a glittering weekend? Glitzy isn't necessarily tacky. Glitzy is just what happens when you get too many rich people who are accustomed to the best of everything in the same place at the same time. Tom?
Douglas, there's a rumor going around here that now that they're not going to use that podium for the president's speech or for the swearing-in ceremonies, you're going to have it converted to a duck blind for the flyover from the Potomac River. Anything to that?
At least 100,000 ducks fly away on the Chesapeake Bay when they see this hat coming, Tom.
I would think so, and a lot of other folks as well. Thanks very much, Douglas Kiker. By the way, one of the president's good friends from California, Holmes Tuttle, who has been an enormous success and a close political ally of the president, caught me last night and said, you all are making too much of the richness of this inauguration. A lot of us are self-made men, and this is just a tribute to the system in this country.
He's absolutely right.
Right.
The richest inaugural in history cost $16 million. That was an enormous amount. That was Reagan 1.
Right.
This one is the second most expensive at 11 or 12 million. That's Reagan 2. It is pretty expensive.
Well, the fact is that they say that this is, these are people who have done well. They've gone from the West, many of them, places like Oklahoma out to California, found their fortune, and they want to pay tribute to the political system that lets them do that.
Yeah, but you know, Tom, the committee is in bad trouble because this was to have paid for itself with admission seats along the parade route. No parade means no revenue.
They got to
give all that tickets. They've
they
got
have
to give the money back, and they're going to be in very, very serious trouble because of the weather. I mean, millions of dollars worth of trouble.
About $1 million altogether they're going to have to give back. Well, to give you an idea of what's going on here, Ridgewell's, the principal caterers, have been catering 75 parties with 50 trucks, 15,000 guests, 7,000 tomatoes, 4,000 eggs, 1,250 lobsters, 3,000 gallons of wine. We'll be back with more from Inauguration 85 after this.
(1809). After James Madison was sworn in, his wife, Dolly, staged the first American inaugural ball. She was magnificent in yellow gown and turban. He said, "I would much rather be in bed."
It's now 2 degrees above zero. The high is expected today to hover in the 2s or so, but the wind chill now has dropped to 17 degrees below zero. Another reason why the parade has been canceled and the public swearing-in ceremonies have been moved inside. Normally on this day, by the way, the high is 44 degrees in Washington, D.C., and the normal low is about 29 degrees. And in the early 1930s, 1933, they moved the inaugural date from early March to late January because they thought that it would improve the weather. That's now in some historic and accurate and real-time dispute. By the way, President Reagan is the first man to serve a second full term, if he completes this term, of course, as everyone expects that he will, since Dwight Eisenhower, of course, in the 1950s. And already there has been some rearrangement of his administration, although not as drastically as a lot of people expected that there may be. Standing by at the White House now in the Roosevelt Room is one of our NBC News White House correspondents, Andrea Mitchell, and she's going to bring us up to date on what we can expect from all of the president's men and their new offices. Andrea?
Tom, it's nice and warm in here. Well, the president said that he did not want to break up a winning team, but he is bringing in a new coach and general manager. At a time when Mr. Reagan has to move quickly on both the budget and arms control, there will be a clean sweep of the White House staff. Typically, the idea did not come from the president.
Call the roll.
When they call the roll at the morning staff meeting, a new cast of players will answer. Assuming they're confirmed by the Senate, Jim Baker will be Treasury Secretary. Ed Meese will be Attorney General. Mike Deaver, the third man in the original Troika, will be scratching other people's backs, making money in public relations. With William Clark going home to his ranch, the president will be left without any of his California cronies. Why should that matter? Because it is here in the morning meeting that the president's men decide what will happen each day. Only later do they tell the president. More than any of his recent predecessors, Ronald Reagan depends on his staff.
Don Reagan and Jim Baker have both served loyally and admirably as members of my team for the past 4 years.
Even a dramatic change like the Baker-Reagan job swap wasn't his idea. In fact, he was the last to know what was going on with his staff.
Oh, I think that what he does is treat them with benign neglect, and that's not all bad. He selects the right people whom he can trust and gives them general guidelines of policy and pretty much adopts a laissez-faire method of running the presidency.
What Laxalt calls benign neglect has permitted tongue wars among the cabinet members. Schultz versus Weinberger over arms control and the use of military force. Weinberger versus Stockman, and now Reagan over defense spending. Reagan versus Stockman over budget cuts. Clark versus Baker over everything.
The individuals at the top, the Troika, the National Security Advisor, really have worked together reasonably well through the 4-year period.
Even during the time when the National Security Advisor wanted a polygraph test to see if the Chief of Staff was a liar?
Well, there have been instances where perhaps there wasn't as much harmony as there's been other times, but...
More and more often, nothing got resolved until the First Lady stepped in.
I don't think that the First Lady's role should ever have been underestimated. I think that she has always played a very, very important role because she is his best friend.
The president's best friend hasn't solved the problem of a labor secretary under indictment or what to do with Gene Kirkpatrick. But the cabinet shuffle will bring in a tough ex-Marine, someone to crack the whip.
It'll be like a breath of fresh air because the old crowd was overworked, pooped and tired, and understandably so.
You're not going to have the competing centers of power. You're not going to have one playing off against the other. And I think it's going to be much easier for Don Reagan to say, this secretary isn't cutting it, Mr. President.
With us now is that ex-Marine, a tough ex-Marine to crack the whip. Mr. Secretary, how are you going to whip this place into shape?
Well, I'm not going to whip it into shape. I'm going to gradually get it into shape by simply changing staff where necessary, bringing in some new faces, and maybe repositioning some of the faces that are here.
I understand that you've talked to some people about what to do about this, former presidents, including Richard Nixon. What advice did Richard Nixon give you?
Well, he said that he thought President Reagan was doing the right thing in having one chief of staff and putting me both on the National Security Council and at cabinet level. And he said that he thought I should get some new people.
Does that mean that he, Richard Nixon, and you as well don't think that it's been run very well up until now?
Oh, no, because it's changing now. You see, there were 3, and now there's going to be 1, so inevitably it has to change.
You know, the conservatives were really euphoric about getting Jim Baker out of the White House and over to Treasury, further away from the Oval Office, if you will. How are you different in philosophy than Jim Baker?
I don't think there's really that much difference. As far as I'm concerned, I'm open to suggestions from people. I'll listen to people. I do believe in the Reagan philosophies, his plans and policies, and it's going to be my job to see that they're carried out.
I think Tom Brokaw has a question for you.
Mr. Reagan, the president is a lame duck after all, which diminishes his political pressure that he can apply both in Congress and around the country. Are you going to use his enormous popularity and bicycle him around Washington and the country a lot more than he has in the past?
Tom, this man is far from a lame duck. He's just at the start of his next 4 years. He could be very effective over those 4 years, and I'm predicting that we'll use him quite effectively to get what he wants, but we won't overdo it with him.
All right, thanks Donald Reagan and Andrea Mitchell in the Roosevelt Room of the White House today. Thanks very much for being there. And on Capitol Hill all day long, stationed just outside the rotunda, or maybe in the rotunda right now for all I know, although he'll have to move aside when the president arrives, is NBC News chief political correspondent Roger Mudd with one of the president's closest personal friends and political advisors. Roger?
Tom, this is not the rotunda. It's a small little hideaway that Senator Dole, the majority leader, has allowed us to use while they secure the rotunda. The rotunda will be filled this afternoon and this morning, instead of by 140,000, by more like 400 House, Senate, governors, diplomatic corps, cabinet, Supreme Court. One of the members of the Senate who is going to be in there is Senator Paul Laxalt, and he's with us this morning. Welcome, Senator.
Thank you, Roger.
We just finished watching Andrea Mitchell's piece, and you were on that piece saying that President Reagan treated his staff with benign neglect. What's that mean?
Well, that means he lets them do their own things within the policy parameters that he establishes for them. He's a great delegator, and I think that's much of his, the key to much of his success, Roger.
Do you think that is the magic way to run the presidency in the 20th century?
I think it is for Ronald Reagan. He's always operated that way. He's surrounded himself with good people. As I said, establish the policy, then let them do their own thing. It's worked well here.
And what about the switch from the three-headed staff, that's an inelegant phrase, the troika staff, to a single chief executive officer? Is that an improvement, or is that just running in place?
I think it's a distinct improvement. I, for one, had a lot of reservations about running a White House with a committee. But that's how it finally came down, and it worked reasonably well. But I think having a single chief of staff is going to make it better all the way around, and particularly for the president. Don Reagan, having the authority and responsibility by himself, has the potential, and he'll realize that potential of being a very effective chief of staff.
Do you have any feeling of a letdown, Senator, during the second inauguration? Everybody feels that the second time around is not quite as exciting as the first.
It's not quite as exciting, but it's still quite exciting. I think it's exciting from the prospects that we all have of having a very successful second term.
Okay, I like your boots, Senator.
Thank you, Roger.
All right, Tom?
He always has those boots on, Roger. Thanks very much, Roger Mudd and Senator Paul Laxalt at the Capitol. Laxalt and Governor and President Reagan first became acquainted with each other when Paul Laxalt was governor of Nevada. Just to straighten out history a little bit, it was in 1833 that Andrew Jackson moved back inside to take the oath of office, then moved outside to deliver his inaugural address. It was in 1829 that he moved the whole inaugural ceremonies outdoors at the Capitol. And today, of course, they'll be moved back indoors to the Rotunda. We'll be dealing with a lot of this history throughout the day here on NBC, and we'll continue our coverage after this.
1829. Andrew Jackson, the first Western president from west of Pittsburgh, was sworn in. Thousands of Jackson's supporters flocked to the city, mobbing the White House, breaking furniture, and forcing the people's president to leave by the back door.
Albany.
Inauguration 85 coverage for NBC News continues now. And John, down through the years, a lot of inaugural speeches, of course, not necessarily memorable, were not even heard because of wind and rain and other circumstances. And no matter how much we have altered today's schedule, it still is, in a true sense, an electronic public ceremony because the president will deliver his speech from the rotunda and the entire nation can hear it.
Well, most of these speeches have been heard only by the people sitting directly in front of the president.
Right.
Even if you were outside and sitting over to either the right or the left of the president, you couldn't hear it. And it was until very recently that they began to be amplified, and then very quickly after that put on radio and television.
And despite some exceptions, as I say, there have been very few memorable speeches. Ask not. We all remember President Kennedy.
Well, Roosevelt.
And Roosevelt. We have nothing to fear but fear itself and so on. There have been certain consistent themes, however. In 1805, Thomas Jefferson promised the suppression of unnecessary government offices. In 1829, Andrew Jackson, that man of the people, promised growth of the military, the bulwark of our defense. In 1897, William McKinley said government should not be permitted to run behind or increase its debts in times like the present. Well, Chris Wallace has a report for us now on what President Reagan said 4 years ago and what he is likely to say today. The promise is to be kept and to be made again. Chris?
Well, Tom, first of all, today's speech is supposed to be short, less than 20 minutes. There will be a few specifics. The president is expected to commit himself to a budget freeze this year, to tax simplification, and to make a big pitch for his Star Wars anti-missile plan. But mostly it will be Reagan rhetoric, how to continue what he calls the American renewal. And if the past is any indication, what a president says at his inaugural is what he later does. The inaugural address is a kind of presidential roadmap, an opportunity to set a tone and direction for the next 4 years. Franklin Roosevelt used his first inaugural to rally the country from the despair of the Depression.
The only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
John Kennedy used his inaugural to declare that a new generation had taken over.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
Ronald Reagan's speech 4 years ago won't be remembered for a dramatic phrase, but it did give a preview of where he would take the country. Here is a report card. His main promise to turn the country around by cutting what government spends and taxes.
It is time to reawaken this industrial giant, to get government back within its means, and to lighten our punitive tax burden.
Reagan came through. He cut personal income taxes 25%. Government spending continued to go up, but not as fast. And the country did seem to turn around. Inflation came down by 2/3. Unemployment jumped during the 1982 recession, but now is slightly lower than when Reagan took office. Not a perfect record, but a clear grade of pass. But what about deficits, which the new president said caused social and economic upheaval?
For decades, we have piled deficit upon deficit, mortgaging our future and our children's future for the temporary convenience of the present.
Reagan did something about deficits, all right. He tripled them, due largely to his big tax cut and defense increase. No question about this grade, failed. In foreign policy, the president outlined his basic strategy. Build up the military and force the Soviets to negotiate.
We will maintain sufficient strength to prevail if need be, knowing that if we do so, we have the best chance of never having to use that strength.
Reagan took care of the strength, increasing the defense budget 75% over 4 years. The problem, after 4 tense years, the Soviets are just now starting to negotiate. The grade here, incomplete. Finally, leadership. For in his first inaugural, Reagan attacked the notion that the U.S. and the presidency were in decline.
I do not believe in a fate that will fall on us no matter what we do. I do believe in a fate that will fall on us if we do nothing.
And over the next 4 years, Reagan made the presidency look like fun, not punishment, destroying the idea that the job was just too big for one man. For leadership, a straight A. One top Reagan advisor says the secret of this president's popularity is that he generally does what he says he's going to do. So you may want to write down today's promises and keep your own report card over the next 4 years. Tom?
Chris, we'll ask you to do that, actually, and then you can check in on Nightly News from time to time, and we'll be doing our duty there.
That's the deal.
Thanks very much. Chris Wallace at the White House today. Chris was also there yesterday when the official swearing in of President Reagan and Vice President Bush occurred in a kind of semi-private but televised event. It was January 20th. That's the day that the Constitution decrees that the President and the Vice President must take the oath of office. So they arranged ceremonies in the grand foyer of the White House, and we want to show those to you now.
President, if you will place your left hand on the Bible and raise your right hand and repeat after me. I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute.
That I will faithfully execute.
The office of President of the United States.
The office of President of the United States.
And will, to the best of my ability.
And will, to the best of my ability.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
The Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
So help me God.
My congratulations, sir.
Ronald Reagan, President of the United States for a second term. It's now official. Today's public ceremonies will be just that, ceremonial, when he is sworn in, because he is already certified as the re-elected President of the United States.
I have something I can't figure out. Why do they say put your left hand on the Bible and your right hand up? Do they expect that Mr. Reagan would put his right hand on the Bible and his left hand up? They did that yesterday to the Vice President and to the President, and I thought it was kind of unnecessary. Couldn't they just say, would you place your hand on the Bible, please? She was holding it at his left side.
Well, I think that they go through a certain code and manual down there. No one wants to be off track in any possible way.
Well, we'll see if it happens again today up at the...
We do it by the numbers. They're getting ready in the rotunda right now where the ceremonies have been moved at the Capitol, of course. It is one of the most spectacular rooms, I suppose, in all of America. We can show those to you now. And, John, as we look at that, these will be the elected officials who have been elected governors and members of Congress and so on, because they can only confine this guest list to about 400 as opposed to the 140,000 that they expected there.
I guess that cuts out the diplomatic corps and a lot of other visitors that normally attend these things. These
That's
are members of Congress.
Yeah. Now, the president is a lame duck, an old phrase that goes back to, I think, Victorian England when businessmen were bankrupt, according to Bill Sapphire, who has that political slang dictionary. But the fact of the matter is that a president serving a second term, despite all the protestations of his aides, simply does not have, traditionally, the political leverage of a president in his first term who is always a threat to run against you in some fashion.
Well, the whole lame duck business is interesting, as is the business of the date of the inaugural. When, in 1792, when they passed the first statute on setting the date of the inaugural, it took 5 days to go from Philadelphia to Baltimore by stagecoach in the wintertime. So what they did was they said that 1 month after the people voted, the Electoral College would vote. And then 2 months after that, the Congress would approve the electoral vote tally, and then another month they would have the inauguration. Now, as you know, Tom, two senators, Pell of Rhode Island and Mathias of Maryland, have introduced legislation saying, why don't we do it quickly? Let's face up to the fact that you can get on a jet plane and get right to Washington. If Lincoln had been inaugurated right after the election in 1860, it's conceivable that the Civil War might not have turned out the way it did. But Lincoln had to wait that 3-month period doing absolutely nothing. And it makes no sense in a technological age. Now we've got it down, thanks to an amendment passed in 1933, to 75 days. But 75 days doesn't make a lot of sense. We could bring in these new presidents and do it in January, get the Congress in January, and get the whole thing off. The people gave Ronald Reagan in 1980 a huge vote. They wanted Reagan. Why did they have to wait 75 days?
We do have that period of drift.
I mean, it is a period of drift, and the people's wishes are not being fulfilled in that time, and so therefore, what Pell and Mathias are saying seems to me a great deal of sense.
We're going to talk about Ronald Reagan, the man and the politician, in just a few moments. The fact of the matter is that when he first began running for governor of California in 1966, he was 55 years old. He is now firmly established as one of the most popular politicians in the history of the Republic. He said then that he just wanted to be a citizen politician. He served in office for 16 years of his life, if he completes this term, as everyone expects him to, of course. We'll show you that and much more in Inauguration 85 as we continue our coverage after this.
1865. It had been raining as Abraham Lincoln prepared to deliver his second inaugural address. As he began to speak, the sun came out. Many in the crowd thought it was an omen, and Lincoln himself said, "It made my heart jump."
You're looking at a prime example of the new forward thinking at Ford. A family sedan conceived and created to change your thinking about family sedans. Its name, Ford Tempo. with front-wheel drive for sure-footed traction. It's a family sedan that doesn't look or act like one. Front-wheel drive Ford Tempo, the forward-thinking car. Have you driven the best-built American cars? Have you driven a Ford lately?
Club sandwich, heavy on the Miracle Whip salad dressing.
No Miracle Whip.
No Miracle Whip today.
Oh, no. Well, I'll have the soup.
Yeah.
Ham on rye, Miracle Whip salad dressing on both sides.
No Miracle Whip today.
Oh, no. Well, I'll have the soup.
A sandwich just isn't a sandwich without the tangy zip of Miracle Whip salad dressing, the bread spread from Kraft.
We're out of Miracle Whip.
Oh,
then we're out of soup.
Don't laugh. But I started using Uncle Ben's after I was in this taste test. They had a whole lot of us comparing Uncle Ben's and the other leading national brand. My rice. What a difference. Uncle Ben's looked better, tasted better, wasn't sticky. Turns out Uncle Ben's beat my old rice, something like 2-to-1. I was pretty embarrassed. But you ought to taste my chicken and rice now.
Uncle Ben's converted brand rice. It really does make a difference.
I'm not a doctor, but I play one on TV. And when many adults get a cough, they play doctor at home. They treat their cough with the same medicine they originally bought for their children. They need one of the adult formulas from Vicks for the coughs adults get with the strength
A little bit in American history. Not so long ago, what odds would you have given that Ronald Reagan, who was really a B-movie actor at the time, would have been elected twice governor of California and re-elected president of the United States, in both cases by historic margins? Probably you would have given very good odds on all of that. But the fact of the matter is, Ronald Reagan has become one of the most popular politicians of the 20th century. He's often said that I would rather be lucky than good, and a lot of his friends think that he is the luckiest politician in America. But he has become a force to reckon with. Ronald Wilson Reagan. Whatever you may think of his politics, Ronald Reagan is the embodiment of the American dream. A handsome Irishman with a natural gift of gab, a gee-whiz personality, a simple, straightforward political philosophy. He's a product of small-town, middle America, and with his success, he has good reason to believe in his flag-waving, Yankee Doodle dandy vision of this country.
Corporal Jones, I've decided that you don't know what the war is all about. We're free people fighting for the right to remain free, to work and to be married and to raise a family in a fine, decent country.
Eileen, honey, I know that.
Jefferson put it a lot better than I can, but if all the American people know all the facts, they'll never make a mistake.
Ronald Reagan has lived it, in person and on the screen. Indeed, it's sometimes difficult to tell where his Hollywood life ends and his political life begins.
After all, I came from an industry in which ham is the basic ingredient. Now, you know what a ham is in our business. This is an actor you don't have to egg on.
Well, there I was, right out in the middle of Kansas, facing 500 crazy fanatics, heavily armed, and me with only 15 soldiers.
Heavens, Captain, how terrifying. What did you do?
I sized up the situation at a glance, dismounted, and walked straight toward him.
Not alone.
My dear young lady, there comes a time in every soldier's life when he must stand or fall alone.
We just want you to know the reinforcements are here, the cavalry is ready, and we intend to march with you until victory is yours on Election Day 1984.
Corny? Well, some people thought so. Mostly seasoned politicians who were inclined to dismiss him as a right-wing kook, just an actor, when he decided to run for governor of California against incumbent Edmund G. Pap Brown. Characteristically, Reagan turned those attacks to his advantage.
He said that while he'd been building California all by himself these last 8 years, his opponent, that's me, had been busy making movies and being on TV. Well, now that's true. I was earning a living.
I think he's a good human being. I think that that people like him, and if he weren't a good human being, they wouldn't. But he's so much better than any of us politicians on television. And he knows how to act. He's always smiling. He's always waving. It's just too much for a common, ordinary politician like a governor of California.
A conservative with charm.
Okay, will you follow me to the right?
I'll follow you to the right. Always to the right.
And when the traditional values of the country were under assault, Reagan was unapologetically for the flag, for God, for motherhood, and apple pie.
The problems we face can be solved by calling on the people, all of the people, and the great abilities of our people instead of imposing the will of a big brother, whether he be in Sacramento or Washington. Work and family are at the center of our lives, the foundation of our dignity as a free people.
A simple but powerful message for a country beginning to doubt itself. A message delivered by that cherished symbol of America, the cowboy.
I did Mr. Reagan because I thought he had such strong lines in his face.
I mean, I've so badly misjudged him from the time he entered the race against me for governor that that being realistic, I have to doubt my own judgment.
When you ask people like Bob Strauss, who managed a campaign against him, yes, we underestimated him. I think people do underestimate Ronald Reagan. He has a unique style of leadership.
We'll have to await the judgment of history on his policies. But for now, this is undeniable. Ronald Reagan is one of the most popular politicians of 20th century America.
All right, men, you know who's going to be out in front tonight? Our boss, the President of the United States. Now, you guys have given a lot of great shows, but tonight's got to be the best one of all.
Well, the first thrill tonight was to find myself for the first time in a long time in a movie on prime time.
And a day like today is almost built for Ronald Reagan, John, because he'll need all of his charm to make everyone feel good about the altered schedule, and he'll be up there and it'll be a kind of an ad-lib situation, and he does that extremely well.
You remember what Jimmy Stewart said here a couple of nights ago? He said, Hollywood used to be a place where a man could play second banana to a chimpanzee on one day and become president of the United States on another. And Stewart added, I'm glad it didn't happen the other way around.
That's right. Bedtime for Bonzo. Ronald Reagan, now president of the United States for a second term, and the public ceremonies will take place in a kind of quasi-private way in here, the rotunda of the Capitol of the United States. We'll be talking more about that later, but those are great patriotic paintings that you see in the background there, depicting various events in American history. And the guest list today, confined now to about 400 people, will be confined largely to public officials, governors and so on. In the foreground there, you can see with the gray hair, Newt Gingrich, who is a conservative member of the House of Representatives. We'll be hearing a lot from him in the next 4 years or so. And Roger Mudd now, just off the rotunda in that hideaway office of Bob Dole, with another important member of Congress. Roger, good morning.
Good morning, Tom. There are such things as Democrats, believe it or not. Most of our concentration the past hour has been on Republicans, the joyful ones, the ones who are watching this inauguration of President Reagan. But there is a Democrat with us this morning. He's Tom Foley. He's the Assistant Majority Leader of the House of Representatives. Mr. Foley, a moment ago, you and I were watching former Governor Brown of California say that Ronald Reagan was so much better than most politicians that you just couldn't touch him. Is that the secret to Ronald Reagan, that he's better on TV than you are?
Well, I think he's one of the greatest probably political performers of television in the history of the medium. There's no question about that. He's a uniquely well-liked, and part of that is, I think, the personality that comes through on the television and the media generally.
So what has that meant to the Democratic Party? You took a terrible beating here a month ago, and I haven't been able to find much in the paper or on television or in meetings that the Democrats are doing anything to get back in shape. What are you all doing?
Well, we're going to be working through the next 2 years, not only on national policy issues, but on a number of issues that affect the party. And I think there's a sense that the Democratic Party needs to bring itself into sharper focus in terms of the issues and presentations it's going to make to the country. Governor Brown's statement that you can't beat Ronald Reagan on television may be true, but I think in addition to his own personality and his likability, the president was in a unique situation this year of having a rising economy, a sense of national well-being throughout most of the country. There's much that hasn't happened yet for agriculture, for many of the unemployed, but for most people there was a sense that things were getting better, and that's always an advantage to an incumbent president. But the Democrats, on the other hand, find themselves in a situation where the issues that we think are important still, fairness in the society, peace and arms control, are issues that are shared by many Americans. We just, I think, have to find a way to present those with greater force and effectiveness than we have in recent months.
Well, you're going to need to find the way at least by 1988, or you got serious problems up ahead.
Let me just make one comment, because
yes,
I think
sir.
it's interesting that after an election, it's occasionally the case that people say, well, this party or that party is in trouble. After 1964, the Republicans were supposed to be in terrible trouble. Barry Goldwater had been defeated by a landslide by Lyndon Johnson, and the end of the Republican Party was actually being predicted in some quarters.
So you're not downcast by the events of November?
By this. Our two parties are strong. We have a two-party system. Well, one party will take a minority position to the other from time to time, but it's very dangerous to count either party out.
Well, I didn't mean to do that. Thank you, Mr. Foley. Tom Foley, the Assistant Majority Leader of the House from Washington State. Tom?
Thank you, Roger Mudd and Congressman Foley. Back in just a few moments, we'll show you just some of the souvenirs that you can have, even if you're not here in Washington on this bitterly cold day. We'll be talking more about this and the other ways that the Inaugural Committee wants to make dough, because that's what it's all about, bottom line. Continuing coverage after this.
1881. As James A. Garfield was sworn in, his aged mother looked on. She was the first mother ever to be present to see her son inaugurated. When it became obvious Garfield would be late for the ceremonies, the Senate doorkeeper turned back the clock by 5 minutes, and the inaugural began on time.
At AT&T, we know you never think about our torture tests.
Oh, but just the phone.
Or about our extraordinary quality control.
I hear you fine, Mom. Australia's only halfway around the world.
Or even about how reliably we design things.
Still works. Who ever heard of a computer that works without air conditioning?
You can take everything we do for granted because we leave nothing to chance.
It's not a total loss. The phone still works.
Whether it's telephones, long-distance, information systems, or computers, AT&T.
Do cats love the great taste of Friskies? You bet. It's the taste that has them jumping for joy and walking on air. Friskies has a way of baking that great flavor right in. The great taste of Friskies. Very satisfying.
It's the quick, thick, liquid bowl cleaner new Swish. It's the clean, green, liquid bowl cleaner new Swish.
Swish's thick green liquid clings to the bowl, clings to the rim, and it cleans as it clings. It deep cleans, it fights rust, it kills germs, and nicest of all, Swish releases a fresh-cut fragrance.
It's the quick, thick, liquid bowl cleaner new Swish. It's the clean, green, liquid bowl cleaner new Swish.
It cleans as it clings.
Now you can freshen carpet, fabric, the air. Everywhere with the luxury fragrances of new Dry Breezes. Not wet, it's dry.
Dry Breezes.
Spray directly on fabric to eliminate trapped odors safely without staining. Spray the air to release its extraordinary fragrance.
Dry Breezes.
Dry Breezes in 3 luxury fragrances.
Freshen fabric, the air, everywhere.
Dry Breezes.
Freshen everywhere with luxury fragrances.
Tom Brokaw with John Chancellor back here on the NBC News Yankee Doodle Dandy set that we have on this Inauguration 1985 day. And Republicans, more than Democrats, always think of profit first when they're organizing something like this. And I talked to Doug Blazer last night, who's in charge. Yes, that's the President of the United States just joining us here today. Actually, this is one of the items that you can order from the Inaugural Committee catalog. Doug Blazer's in charge of that, and he was telling me last night they've made 5,000 of these, John, altogether.
How much?
$295, mail order, Royal Dalton, China, and they expect that that will become a collector's item, or at least that they hope that it will. They like to make a few dollars off that.
I liked it this way.
A couple of other items. Yes. Republicans will get it because it will be an important keepsake to them. Democrats will get it maybe for other reasons to have it. The license plates, you can get them personalized, and they're good in a lot of states until March 15th.
They're good in every state for 60 days.
Yeah, until I think March 15th. They run $30 to $50, I think, altogether. A set of memorabilia coins, medallions struck especially for this. These run a little more money, $675 for this set altogether. Get my finger caught in there. You even have now the official inaugural sweatshirt, you see, for the teenagers. We the People sweatshirt. All manner of things that they hope to be able to get back and get a fair return on their investment. The inaugural plate, you could practically furnish the whole house.
How did it ever strike you? You're very good at that.
Huckstring, we don't have the Vegematic, right? Work that in somehow here today as well. At any rate, we were talking about the money earlier. They were able to raise, what, $8 million the first go-around?
$9 million. $8 to $9 million in 12 days in interest-free loans from corporations and individuals, a lot of defense contractors. One guesses that those donors can afford to wait a little while for their money to be given back because they were fat cats. And because they can't sell the tickets now, there will be no parade. They're going to lose, what did you say, Tom, $1 million in revenue on that?
On the parade alone, I think that's the estimate. Of course, everyone is still trying to figure out what that'll cost. One final item here, John. This is the Nancy Reagan Rose that has been done up as well.
Is that in
the price
plastic?
That is not in plastic. This one will cost you a few bucks as well. Almost everything here does, of course. I guess I've lost the price
Well, Tom
tag
looks up the price. One thing to keep in mind.
$475, by the way.
Well, the inaugural committee estimated that all of this, forget the $9 million for a while, will cost the taxpayers $1.5 million, and that's all.
Here's the President of the United States, John, leaving the White House now to go in the traditional route to the Capitol. Chris Wallace is at the White House.
Well, yes, Tom, the President and Mrs. Reagan have been having coffee for about the last half hour in the Blue Room, and they certainly will need that coffee with what is called the Joint Congressional Inaugural Escort Committee. A number of members of Congress from both parties have been up here exchanging pleasantries with the President and First Lady, and the President will be riding up Pennsylvania Avenue in his car with Senator Mathias of Maryland, who is the chairman of the Joint Congressional Inaugural Committee, and with House Speaker Tip O'Neill, who is perhaps Ronald Reagan's fiercest foe in this town, although not today. But if they get into something like Social Security, they could have a pretty interesting conversation during the few moments it will take to go from the White House up to the Capitol. You may have noticed Mrs. Reagan is wearing an electric blue coat and hat today, and there is a reason that she chose that color. It's because when NBC was projecting states for her husband on election night, we lit the states up on our electoral map as blue. By the end of the night, of course, the whole country except Minnesota and D.C. were electric blue, and that had become her new favorite color. This is a new presidential limousine that just in the last year that they have unveiled, and it has a new high top, which makes it easier for people on the sides to see the president. There's no sliding roof, unlike earlier presidential limousines, which means that the president will make the trip up and down Pennsylvania Avenue today completely unclosed, which is unusual. I think it costs, according to some estimates, about $250,000, and it is outfitted with thick glass and thick steel plate. It's like a Sherman tank. Today's trip up the avenue has none of the drama of 1981 or earlier inaugurals where there was a switch of power. For instance, 4 years ago when the Reagans and the Carters came out and obviously were none too comfortable with each other. This time it's really just the Reagans in their limousine going up Pennsylvania Avenue, although, of course, it's still a very special trip. You can see them going up Pennsylvania Avenue, the streets which should have been filled with thousands of people on those stands, completely deserted because the parade has been called off, and everyone is doing what you folks are at home watching it on TV.
You're seeing a quick frozen city, Chris Wallace. That's keeping everyone inside, and for security reasons, of course, the Secret Service announced to people who were expecting to have parties along the route that they ought not to have anyone appear suddenly or unexpectedly at a window. Security's been very tight. Manhole covers have been welded down on Pennsylvania Avenue.
They were either going to remove mailboxes or seal them shut, too, so nobody could place a time bomb in them. You know, this has just been a burgeoning thing, obviously starting with the presidential assassination attempt in 1981, and then especially with all of the terrorist attacks overseas in Lebanon and in the Middle East. And during the 1984 campaign, you could just see the security precautions increasing.
Chris, there was some talk that the president may change his route today, but in fact it looks like he's going up Pennsylvania Avenue as expected, where he'll go to the Capitol, and there will be a change then in the scheduling there. He had been expected to be in a small holding room, then walk beneath the rotunda out onto that platform that has been erected on the west front of the Capitol, which shows you that magnificent view of the Washington Monument, the entire ellipse area looking west to his homeland, really, California. Now, the ceremonies will take place instead in the rotunda, the great rotunda of the Capitol. There will be a luncheon afterward, just off the rotunda, and representative Americans have been invited to that luncheon, including a truck driver and a fireman and a man who's a narcotics officer, and he has to appear undercover. He's not been consenting to interviews in which his face can be shown.
Tom?
Yes, Chris.
Well, of course, as you know, 4 years ago, Ronald Reagan was the first president to hold his swearing in on the west front of the Capitol, and I think it meant a lot to him as a Westerner. It also was a much more picturesque setting. In fact, in the past, presidents had their swearing-ins on the east front, which basically overlooked a parking lot, and finally someone got the smart idea to do it on the west front, which overlooks the mall here in Washington, and all of the magnificent monuments. You can see the Smithsonian institutions on the right and the left, and down, of course, at the end of the mall, the Lincoln and Jefferson memorials. So it was, I think, perhaps fitting that a Westerner should be the first person to be sworn in on the Western Front, and they certainly were looking forward to doing it again, and the months of preparation for that, a whole facelifting, cleaning of the west front of the Capitol, and of course, because of the weather, all that changes overnight.
Not only a Westerner, Chris, but a budget cutter. It costs less to build the stands on the west front of the Capitol than it does on the east because you can put in portable seats.
Pennsylvania Avenue has been greatly changed since John Kennedy rode down this avenue in 1961, and he was appalled by the condition of many of the buildings along the way, and among other things, the National Trust for Historic Preservation has been working at saving the buildings, refurbishing many of them. The old Willard Hotel, where President Lincoln stayed the night before his inauguration, has been saved now and rehabilitated. Steve Delaney is along that route out there in the cold. Steve?
It should have been an hour or so from now if he were going to have his inaugural here. I can see the leading cars in the motorcade kind of making that left turn to get them onto Constitution Avenue and come up around the north side of the Capitol. It must be kind of sad for the president to sit in that car and watch nobody visible along the sidewalks. Once they moved everything inside, there's only 30 or 40 people standing here watching that parade go by, and most of them are doing just what I am, talking about it and anticipating the ceremonies will be inside. Once the motorcade gets up around the Senate side of the Capitol, he'll pull up to a doorway on the east side, the traditional side of these things, and he'll be seen there in just a moment or two. Tom?
Thank you, Steve. There's the Capitol now coming into view. He arrives, as we say, on the east front, where there is enormous parking and very restricted parking at that. Any number of decals are necessary to have a place there except for the President of the United States, who arrives traditionally by this route for State of the Union addresses, for inaugural ceremonies, for rare appearances at Congress.
The President's limousine is now just pulling up on the east front of the Capitol. It will stop in front of what is called the Law Library door. There the President will step out, be greeted. His security limousine just pulling up behind it. Security is very tight here. There are no crowds. There are only security men, photographers, a few reporters standing around as the President steps out of the limousine. House Speaker O'Neill getting out. On the other side, Senator Mathias, and there's the President. Helping Mrs. Reagan from the car. There are no ceremonies planned here, no crowds to greet him, no one to cheer. The President will simply walk inside to begin the ceremonies here at the Capitol. The President now going in a door on the first floor of the Capitol building. Just behind him, walking up the steps here and toward the Capitol, Vice President Bush, accompanied by Senate Majority Leader Dole and House Minority Leader. Yes, sir, Mr. Vice President, how are you doing?
Well, feel pretty good. I'm just sorry that a lot of people are going to miss the festivities, but anyway, here we are.
The Vice President saying he's sorry that so many people are going to miss the festivities along the parade route as he walks indoors. But the ceremonies doubtless will go on just the same.
Thank you very much, Mike. What is your name?
The Vice President stopping just for a moment to give the photographers a chance at a quick picture. Then he goes in the law library door as well.
Well, the official party now has arrived about 5 minutes ahead of schedule, incidentally. They may have gone more rapidly, more swiftly up Pennsylvania Avenue and Constitution Avenue because there were no crowds. The president and the vice president and the assembled members of their party will be in a holding room for a time, and then they will go into the rotunda for the ceremonies. We'll have complete coverage, of course, all afternoon here on NBC, and we'll continue that coverage after this.
1893. When Grover Cleveland was defeated after one term in office, his young wife, Frances, told the servants to leave the furniture the way it was. She said, "We'll be back." 4 years later, they were. Grover Cleveland was the only man ever elected to non-consecutive terms as president.
NBC News presidential inauguration coverage is being sponsored in part by The Sun Company, where there's sun, there's energy, and by Ford and your local Ford dealer. Have you driven a Ford lately?
I'm Tom Brokaw here with John Chancellor in the NBC News Inauguration 85 set, and the president and the vice president and the members of their party now are at the Capitol, having left the White House today, and they are there in a holding room. Very shortly they will go from there, after about a 10 or 12-minute wait, to the Great Rotunda, because the ceremonies have been moved inside because of the bitter cold temperature. Actually, it's getting to be downright balmy, John. It's up to 5 degrees above zero.
What's the wind chill?
And the wind chill is only 15 below at this point. Dangerous conditions in Washington, D.C. Therefore, the parade was canceled, and the ceremonies that were to be outside the Capitol now have been moved inside the Capitol. This is going to change a lot of things. Of course, the souvenirs are going to, we'll have to see what the value is for a ticket that was not used on the only time they had to cancel and move inside zone. This is a first-day cover that the post office issues, of course. We want to show you something. That is the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, and we think this is supposed to be George Bush, but we believe it's John Chancellor, in fact.
If nominated, I will not run. If elected, I will not serve.
Well, we've sent out to order all of these that we can get our hands on. John Chancellor, first-day cover. Emery King has been keeping track of all of the souvenirs that have been available to people who've been coming to Washington for this inaugural weekend, and he has this report on them. Emery?
Inaugural souvenirs in Washington are selling as fast as a hit tune.
You want one that sings? I'll take 10.
From $1 bumper stickers to $12 musical buttons. And for the more serious, the inaugural committee has put out an official line of souvenirs, including a patriotic jar of red, white, and blue jelly beans, a set of personalized inaugural license plates, a cut crystal decorator piece with lid, a Ronald Reagan Royal Dalton mug, a Nancy Reagan bisque porcelain rose, a white bisque porcelain soaring eagle, and a hand-painted American presidential eagle. $1,750. Will people really spend that much money for an eagle?
Yes, 25 people have already.
Most of the official inaugural committee items are sold in department stores.
God must have been sitting on my shoulder.
And committee officials expect even greater sales after the inauguration through mail orders.
Reagan buttons, what kind you like, ma'am?
But street vendors are also making money, selling items the committee hasn't approved.
I've always made out better this way than I have working with the committee.
So after looking at all of these wonderful souvenirs, I've decided that a $1,750 eagle is just a little bit too expensive for my tastes. And some of these other items, like inaugural hats and flashing buttons that sing the Star-Spangled Banner, just really aren't my style. I've decided that the ones you eat are the ones for me, so I'm going to go for the president's lunch. It's a candy bar, and it's a real bargain at $1.60.
Well, there will be no people along the parade route today to buy from all of those vendors who expect to make big dough, and that's too bad for them as well.
Frozen out.
Frozen out, indeed. The President and the Vice President at the Capitol right now in a holding room on the east side of the Capitol, waiting to go into the rotunda. There is the door of the holding room. They will go from there up 2 floors into the rotunda itself. We can show you through the magic of television and my John Madden-like device, the Capitol and the floor plan. Here is the first floor. And the President entered right here, came in this way, and he's in this holding room here. He'll then go up 2 floors, and eventually he'll end up in this area right in here for the ceremonies. He was originally scheduled, of course, to go out here. That now all has been canceled, of course, because of the inclement weather in Washington, D.C. 140,000 people. Many of them, I expect, were not disappointed. I talked to a couple of the President's California friends yesterday, and they were saying, thank God he made that decision. I wasn't going to sit out there. And health would have been endangered for a lot of
A lot of people come here for the parties. There will be 9 or 10 galas tonight. Somebody added it up. If you and your wife came to the inauguration here and stayed in a medium-priced hotel, it would be about $3,000, not counting your airfare.
Pretty expensive. All the limousines in town were sold out, even though for a 4-day period, $2,400 inclusive. That's tip and chauffeur. And there wasn't a car available. Rent-a-wreck, I'm even told. The rent-a-car outfit was down to its last automobile
that was
as well.
For Democratic inauguration.
Well, they may be, but Republicans have to use transportation wherever and whenever they can. And the ceremonies that we expected to see today, of course, have been changed as a result of all of this. The traditional wardrobes of inaugurals, black tie and tails and evening gowns, now have been replaced. The symbols instead are long johns and stocking caps, I would think, for Inauguration 1985. There will be this luncheon that will occur short. Well, let's go to the rotunda now, where, as you can see, people are standing. Mrs. Reagan is arriving with Mrs. Bush, both dressed in blue today. Mrs. Reagan in an outfit designed by Adolfo. Mrs. Bush, as I recall, is in an outfit designed by Bill Blass, 2 well-known American fashion designers. That gets an awful lot of attention on these occasions as well. There are 8 paintings in the rotunda altogether. The baptism of Pocahontas at Jamestown, for example, that's one of them. We have books for these that we've been scrambling. The Declaration of, the signing of the Declaration of Independence at Independence Hall in Philadelphia, the famous John Trumbull painting. Those are the great oil paintings that you'll be seeing in the background there. And then above that are different friezes of historic events down through times. John?
You know, the presidents, when they take the oath these days, although Reagan wore a morning outfit the last time, but tend to look as though they work for IBM. In 1793, when George Washington appeared for his second inaugural, he was dressed as follows: a black velvet suit trimmed with lace, a white satin vest, black hose and shoes with diamond knee buckles and diamond shoe buckles, yellow kid gloves, a dress sword with a jeweled sheath, and a cocked hat. Now that's dressing for your second inaugural.
I saw you going out of the hotel in that very outfit last night.
If it was good enough for George, it's good enough for me.
Vice President George Bush being accompanied now to the rotunda, where he too will be sworn in for a second time. The really formal and official ceremonies took place yesterday at the White House. Those are the ones that count. Today is principally for people who are looking in. It is traditional for presidents to be sworn in on January 20th, before that on March 4th. But when those dates fall on Sundays, the presidents have moved them to another day, Monday. And in this case, not only do we have the Sabbath to deal with, but of course, Super Bowl last night. The president flipped the coin electronically from the White House. So there is a real confluence of sports and television and politics coming together here in the nation's capital in 1985, January 21st, this day, John.
Yes, Monroe decided to wait a day so the United States was without a president. So did Zachary Taylor. He waited a day. Since then, when it's happened on a Sunday, they've all taken the oath just to be safe.
That's right. And there was some dispute yesterday about whether or not the White House would let us into the ceremonies, but then, in fact, they decided that in the interest of history, that they would do that. And I would hope that there would be more of that kind of spirit that would prevail in Washington, because, after all, we are now compiling, at the same time, a written history of this republic. We are compiling, if you will, an electronic videotape history. so that future generations of students and others can go back and have a look for the feel of it. Wouldn't it be marvelous, for example, to have a videotape of George Washington and those ceremonies? When he left Mount Vernon, by the way, to go to New York to be inaugurated the first time, he could barely get through Washington and Georgetown. They kept having parties at every tavern along the way, and finally, after 2 days of that, he said no more stopping at the taverns. There was such celebration with gusto. The President of the United States, accompanied on his right by Senator Mac Mathias, on his left by the Speaker of the House, Thomas P. Tip O'Neill. So the ceremonies now begin. The President going up 2 floors to the rotunda, and Roger Mudd is in the rotunda where we can hear him if we can't see him. Roger?
Tom, when you take a huge rotunda and put into it the House and the Senate and the diplomatic corps, and then you add a Marine Corps band, you've got a very tight-knit group. The great losers in the rearrangement of plans today were the wives. There are no diplomatic wives and no governor's wives, although a few have managed to squeeze in. 400 have jammed into this rotunda. And they have seen in the last few minutes the arrival of the Chief Justice and Mrs. Berger, Vice President and Mrs. Bush. Mrs. Reagan came in almost unannounced from the Senate side, had literally to squeeze her way through a crowd of congressmen and senators, but you could see her easily because of that bright royal blue outfit she has on. Mrs. Bush has a powder blue. They've obviously coordinated that beforehand, but they are now in place. And in a moment or two, we'll get the President of the United States.
Roger, that painting that we see in the background is called The Embarkation of the Pilgrims at Delfthaven, Holland, July 22nd, 1620, just so people are wondering at home. And we'll be seeing more of those paintings because they are situated around the rotunda.
Well, there are paintings. There is the Declaration of Independence. There's the surrender of Burgoyne, the surrender of Cornwallis. There is the signing of the ratification of the Constitution. There is the blessing of Pocahontas, and there is the only thing we don't have, Tom, is a contemporary painting, and they've deliberately kept it that way. In addition, there are a few pieces of statuary in the hall.
Through the far door, as you can see. Everyone forced to stand for this occasion. Backed by members of his cabinet and some of their wives.
Mr. President, Mr. Vice President, fellow citizens, we celebrate today the 50th inauguration of a President and Vice President of the United States, and the beginning of a presidential term that brings us to the threshold of the 3rd century of American constitutional government. I will ask the Reverend Timothy S. Healy, President of Georgetown University, to offer the invocation.
Let us offer this prayer for the President and Vice President and their families, for the people and government of these United States, for men and women of goodwill everywhere, captive and free, who watch us today. Please join me in saying the words our Lord taught us. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
Miss Jessie Norman will now sing Simple Gifts, one of the songs in Aaron Copland's Old American Songs.
Tis the gift to be simple, 'tis the gift to be free, 'tis the gift to come down where you ought to be. And when we find ourselves in the place just right, we'll be in the valley of love and delight. When true simplicity is gained, to bow and to bend, we shan't be ashamed. To turn will be a delight, till by turning we come round right. Tis the gift to be simple, 'tis the gift to be free, 'tis the gift to come down where you ought to be. And when we find ourselves in the place just right, we'll be in the valley of love and delight. Tis the gift to be simple, 'tis the gift to be free, 'tis the gift to come down where you ought to be. And when we find ourselves in the place just right, 'twill be in the valley of love and
Once again, Senator Mathias is in charge of the arrangements for Congress.
I now ask Rabbi Alfred Gottschalk, president of Hebrew Union College of Cincinnati, to offer a prayer.
We, the people, turn to you, O God, in prayer. We have come again to this place which stirs our hearts to reaffirm the highest ideals of our nation. The sacred oaths about to be pronounced in your name reflect the awesome responsibilities entrusted to our President and Vice President by the American people. May you, who are the Rock of Ages, guide them in protecting the Constitution of our beloved Commonwealth, founded in faith, which ensures unity without uniformity. Sustain them, O God, as they advance the American way, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to malevolence no hope. O source of all life, enshrine in their hearts the knowledge that all are created in your image, and that life, your gift to us, is sacred. Inspire our leaders to defeat hunger and hurt, to promote compassion, and to find successful ways to assure the weak their share of America's promise. In humility we pray that this opportunity for renewal will advance reconciliation in the family of nations, guaranteeing peace in our world and tranquility in the farthest reaches of our universe. May those who follow us, our children and our children's children, bless our President and Vice President, their families and all those associated with them in government, and may all remember this time and this administration as that in which their future was made secure. O God, may you who makes peace in high places help us here on earth to find the way to peace. Blessed are you, O God, Oseh HaShalom, granter of peace. Amen.
Justice Potter Stewart will administer the oath of office to the Vice President.
I, George Herbert Walker Bush.
I, George Herbert Walker Bush.
Do solemnly swear.
Do solemnly swear.
That I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States.
That I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
Against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
That I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same.
That I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same.
That I take this oath, this obligation, freely.
That I take this obligation freely.
Without any mental reservation.
Without any mental reservation.
Or purpose of evasion.
Or purpose of evasion.
That I will well and faithfully discharge.
That I will well and faithfully discharge.
The duties of the office.
The duties of the office.
On which I am about to enter.
On which I am about to enter.
So help you God.
So help me God.
The University of Maryland Chorus, under the direction of Dr. Paul Traver, will now sing the first section of Randall Thompson's Testament of Freedom.
At the same time,
University of Maryland chorus consists of faculty members and community members and alums as well. And of course, Maryland is the home state of this man, Senator Mathias, who is in charge of the congressional arrangements.
I will now ask the President's own pastor, the Reverend Don Mumaw of Bel Air Presbyterian Church, to offer a prayer.
Let us all unite in prayer. Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on us. Come, Father, with cleansing power and remove all things from us that would impede your purpose and thwart your plan. Forgive our pride and arrogance before each other and other nations of the world. May we, with godly grace, weep with those who weep and rejoice with those who work for a just and free world. Grant us, O Father, the courage and the compassion to stand in solidarity with the poor, the needy, the dispossessed, and the disadvantaged. May the President and Vice President of these United States and all who stand with him in his desire for peace receive first the peace of Christ, and in all things seek first not the kingdom of plenty or the kingdom of political superiority, but may they seek humbly first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. In the name of the King, even Jesus Christ our Lord, we pray. Amen. Amen.
The Chief Justice will now administer the oath to the President.
"35 words in all, an oath that Abraham Lincoln said is registered in heaven. An oath the President took yesterday, which made him officially President of the United States for another term.
You'll raise your right hand and repeat after me. I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear
That I will faithfully execute.
that I will faithfully execute
The office of President of the United States.
the office of President of the United States.
And will to the best of my ability.
Will to the best of my ability.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
The Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
So help me God.
My congratulations, sir.
Well, however much they may have to rearrange things, you cannot take away from the majesty of that simple oath, the power of that great office. The 21-gun salute outside, and really the dignity of the buildings in Washington and the memorials that you'll see in the background. In this hastily arranged setting, just between the President and Mrs. Reagan in the background with the glasses and the gray hair is his longtime friend Jimmy Stewart. You can see there. And other close friends who have been assembled along with members of Congress and the Senate. And now the inaugural address by the President.
Senator Mathias, Chief Justice Berger, Vice President Bush, Speaker O'Neill, Senator Dole, Reverend clergy, and members of my family and friends, and my fellow citizens, this day has been made brighter with the presence here of one who for a time has been absent, Senator John Stennis. God bless you and welcome back.
Senator Stennis has recently undergone...
There is, however, one who is not with us today. Representative Gillis Long of Louisiana left us last night, and I wonder if we could all join in a moment of silent prayer. There are no words adequate to express my thanks for the great honor that you've bestowed on me. I'll do my utmost to be deserving of your trust. This is, as Senator Mathias told us, the 50th time that we, the people, have celebrated this historic occasion. When the first president, George Washington, placed his hand upon the Bible, he stood less than a single day's journey by horseback from raw, untamed wilderness. There were 4 million Americans in a union of 13 states. Today, we are 60 times as many in a union of 50 states. We've lighted the world with our inventions, gone to the aid of mankind wherever in the world there was a cry for help, journeyed to the moon, and safely returned. So much has changed, and yet we stand together as we did 2 centuries ago. When I took this oath 4 years ago, I did so in a time of economic stress. Voices were raised saying that we had to look to our past for the greatness and glory. But we, the present-day Americans, are not given to looking backward. In this blessed land, there is always a better tomorrow. 4 years ago, I spoke to you of a new beginning, and we have accomplished that. But in another sense, our new beginning is a continuation of that beginning created 2 centuries ago, when, for the first time in history, government, the people said, was not our master, it is our servant. Its only power, that which we, the people, allow it to have. That system has never failed us. But for a time, we failed the system. We asked things of government that government was not equipped to give. We yielded authority to the national government that properly belonged to states or to local governments or to the people themselves. We allowed taxes and inflation to rob us of our earnings and savings and watched the great industrial machine that had made us the most productive people on earth slow down and the number of unemployed increase. By 1980, we knew it was time to renew our faith, to strive with all our strength toward the ultimate in individual freedom consistent with an orderly society. We believed then and now there are no limits to growth and human progress when men and women are free to follow their dreams. And we were right. And we were right to believe that. Tax rates have been reduced, inflation cut dramatically, and more people are employed than ever before in our history. We are creating a nation once again, vibrant, robust, and alive. But there are many mountains yet to climb. We will not rest until every American enjoys the fullness of freedom, dignity, and opportunity as our birthright. It is our birthright as citizens of this great republic. And if we meet this challenge, these will be years when Americans have restored their confidence and tradition of progress, when our values of faith, family, work, and neighborhood were restated for a modern age, when our economy was finally freed from government's grip, when we made sincere efforts at meaningful arms reductions and by rebuilding our defenses, our economy, and developing new technologies, helped preserve peace in a troubled world. When America courageously supported the struggle for individual liberty, self-government, and free enterprise throughout the world, and turned the tide of history away from totalitarian darkness and into the warm sunlight of human freedom. My fellow citizens, our nation is poised for greatness. We must do what we know is right and do it with all our might. Let history say of us, these were golden years when the American Revolution was reborn, when freedom gained new life and America reached for her best. Our two-party system has solved us and served us, I should say, well over the years, but never better than in those times of great challenge when we came together not as Democrats or Republicans, but as Americans united in a common cause. Two of our founding fathers, a Boston lawyer named Adams and a Virginia planter named Jefferson, members of that remarkable group who met in Independence Hall and dared to think they could start the world over again, left us an important lesson. They had become, in the years then in government, bitter political rivals in the presidential election of 1800. And then years later, when both were retired and age had softened their anger, they began to speak to each other again through letters. A bond was reestablished between those two who had helped create this government of ours. In 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, they both died. They died on the same day, within a few hours of each other, and that day was the 4th of July. In one of those letters exchanged in the sunset of their lives, Jefferson wrote, "It carries me back to the times when, beset with difficulties and dangers, we were fellow laborers in the same cause, struggling for what is most valuable to man, his right of self-government, laboring always at the same oar, with some wave ever ahead threatening to overwhelm us, and yet passing harmless, we rode through the storm with heart and hand." Well, with heart and hand, let us stand as one today. One people under God, determined that our future shall be worthy of our past. As we do, we must not repeat the well-intentioned errors of our past. We must never again abuse the trust of working men and women by sending their earnings on a futile chase after the spiraling demands of a bloated federal establishment. You elected us in 1980 to end this prescription for disaster, and I don't believe you re-elected us in 1984 to reverse course. The heart of our efforts is one idea vindicated by 25 straight months of economic growth. Freedom and incentives unleash the drive and entrepreneurial genius that are the core of human progress. We have begun to increase the rewards for work, savings, and investment, reduce the increase in the cost and size of government and its interference in people's lives. We must simplify our tax system, make it more fair, and bring the rates down for all who work and earn. We must think anew and move with a new boldness so every American who seeks work can find work, so the least among us shall have an equal chance to achieve the greatest things, to be heroes who heal our sick, feed the hungry, protect peace among nations, and leave this world a better place. The time has come for a new American emancipation, a great national drive to tear down economic barriers and liberate the spirit of enterprise in the most distressed areas of our country. My friends, together we can do this, and do it we must, so help me God. From new freedom will spring new opportunities for growth, a more productive, fulfilled, and united people, and a stronger America. An America that will lead the technological revolution and also open its mind and heart and soul to the treasures of literature, music, and poetry, and the values of faith, courage, and love. A dynamic economy with more citizens working and paying taxes will be our strongest tool to bring down budget deficits. But an almost unbroken 50 years of deficit spending has finally brought us to a time of reckoning. We've come to a turning point, a moment for hard decisions. I have asked the cabinet and my staff a question, and now I put the same question to all of you. If not us, who? And if not now, when? It must be done by all of us. Going forward with a program aimed at reaching a balanced budget, we can then begin reducing the national debt. I will shortly submit a budget to the Congress aimed at freezing government program spending for the next year. Beyond this, we must take further steps to permanently control government's power to tax and spend. We must act now to protect future generations from government's desire to spend its citizens' money and tax them into servitude when the bills come due. Let us make it unconstitutional for the federal government to spend more than the federal government takes in. We have already started returning to the people and to state and local governments responsibilities better handled by them. Now, there is a place for the federal government in matters of social compassion, but our fundamental goals must be to reduce dependency and upgrade the dignity of those who are infirm or disadvantaged. And here, a growing economy and support from family and community offer our best chance for a society where compassion is a way of life, where the old and infirm are cared for, the young and, yes, the unborn protected, and the unfortunate looked after and made self-sufficient. Now, there is another area where the federal government can play a part. As an older American, I remember a time when people of different race, creed, or ethnic origin in our land found hatred and prejudice installed in social custom and, yes, in law. There's no story more heartening in our history than the progress that we've made toward the brotherhood of man that God intended for us. Let us resolve there will be no turning back or hesitation on the road to an America rich in dignity and abundant with opportunity for all our citizens. Let us resolve that we, the people, will build an American opportunity society in which all of us, white and black, rich and poor, young and old, will go forward together, arm in arm. Again, let us remember that though our heritage is one of bloodlines from every corner of the earth, we are all Americans pledged to carry on this last best hope of man on earth. Now, I've spoken of our domestic goals and the limitations we should put on our national government. Now let me turn to a task that is the primary responsibility of national government, the safety and security of our people. Today we utter no prayer more fervently than the ancient prayer for peace on earth. Yet history has shown that peace does not come, nor will our freedom be preserved by goodwill alone. There are those in the world who scorn our vision of human dignity and freedom. One nation, the Soviet Union, has conducted the greatest military buildup in the history of man, building arsenals of awesome offensive weapons. We've made progress in restoring our defense capability, but much remains to be done. There must be no wavering by us, nor any doubts by others, that America will meet her responsibilities to remain free, secure, and at peace. There is only one way safely and legitimately to reduce the cost of national security, and that is to reduce the need for it. And this we're trying to do in negotiations with the Soviet Union. We're not just discussing limits on a further increase of nuclear weapons. We seek instead to reduce their number. We seek the total elimination one day of nuclear weapons from the face of the earth. Now, for decades, we and the Soviets have lived under the threat of mutual assured destruction. If either resorted to the use of nuclear weapons, the other could retaliate and destroy the one who had started it. Is there either logic or morality in believing that if one side threatens to kill tens of millions of our people, our only recourse is to threaten killing tens of millions of theirs? I have approved a research program to find, if we can, a security shield that will destroy nuclear missiles before they reach their target. It wouldn't kill people. It would destroy weapons. It wouldn't militarize space. It would help demilitarize the arsenals of Earth. It would render nuclear weapons obsolete. We will meet with the Soviets hoping that we can agree on a way to rid the world of the threat of nuclear destruction. We strive for peace and security, heartened by the changes all around us. Since the turn of the century, the number of democracies in the world has grown fourfold. Human freedom is on the march, and nowhere more so than in our own hemisphere. Freedom is one of the deepest and noblest aspirations of the human spirit. People worldwide hunger for the right of self-determination, for those inalienable rights that make for human dignity and progress. America must remain freedom's staunchest friend, for freedom is our best ally. And it is the world's only hope to conquer poverty and preserve peace. Every blow we inflict against poverty will be a blow against its dark allies of oppression and war. Every victory for human freedom will be a victory for world peace. So we go forward today, a nation still mighty in its youth and powerful in its purpose. With our alliances strengthened, with our economy leading the world to a new age of economic expansion, we look to a future rich in possibilities. And all of this is because we worked and acted together, not as members of political parties, but as Americans. My friends, we live in a world that's lit by lightning. So much is changing and will change, but so much endures and transcends time. History is a ribbon, always unfurling. History is a journey. And as we continue our journey, we think of those who traveled before us. We stand again at the steps of this symbol of our democracy, or we would have been standing at the steps if it hadn't gotten so cold. Now we're standing inside this symbol of our democracy. And we see and hear again the echoes of our past. A general falls to his knees in the hard snow of Valley Forge. A lonely president paces the darkened halls and ponders his struggle to preserve the Union. The men of the Alamo call out encouragement to each other. A settler pushes west and sings a song, and the song echoes out forever and fills the unknowing air. It is the American sound. It is hopeful, big-hearted, idealistic, daring, decent, and fair. That's our heritage. That's our song. We sing it still. For all our problems, our differences, we are together as of old. We raise our voices to the God who is the author of this most tender music. And may he continue to hold us close as we fill the world with our sound in unity, affection, and love. One people, under God, dedicated to the dream of freedom that he has placed in the human heart, called upon now to pass that dream on to a waiting and a hopeful world. God bless you, and may God bless America. Thank you.
President Ronald Wilson Reagan, 40th President of the United States, his inaugural address in the rotunda of the Capitol building, a reaffirmation of the philosophy that elected him twice governor of California, now twice president of the United States. A tribute to free enterprise, a call for economic freedom, for less government, a statement about abortion, which he opposes, a strong statement in behalf of the Strategic Defense Initiative, the so-called Star Wars defense that he would like to have installed as part of the nuclear arms equation.
I will ask the Reverend Peter Gomes, minister in the Memorial Church at Harvard University, to pronounce the benediction. Following the benediction, these proceedings will be concluded by the playing of the national anthem by the Marine Corps Band.
Let us pray. Almighty God, who hast given us this good land for our heritage, we humbly beseech thee that we may always prove ourselves a people mindful of thy favor and glad to do thy will. Bless our land with honorable industry, sound learning, and pure manners. Save us from discord, violence, and confusion, and the frailty of our own hearts. Defend our liberties, preserve our unity, and fashion into one united people the multitudes brought hither out of many kindreds and tongues. Endue with the spirit of wisdom, prudence, and fortitude the President and the Vice President of these United States, and all those to whom is entrusted the authority of government, to the end that justice and peace may flourish at home and abroad. Make us, with them, equal to our high trusts, reverent in the use of freedom, just in the exercise of power, generous in the protection of weakness. May wisdom and compassion be the stability of our times and our deepest trust in thee, in whom we live and move and have our being. Unto thee, O Lord, we ascribe all honor and glory, and in thanksgiving and in hope, we commend now to thy eternal protection ourselves, our nation, and our world. Amen.
Senator Mathias asking the President a question there about the next arrangements. They had an elaborate game plan, if we can borrow the football vernacular, for this weekend, of course, and now it's a little bit like a touch football game in the park. You kind of have to make it up as they go along, huddling along the way. This is the photo opportunity of the two families, President and Mrs. Reagan, Vice President and Mrs. Bush.
Tom, there's a nice sense of improvisation about the whole thing. When you look at the picture of all the people in that whole room, it looks like one of the early 19th century paintings.
It does look like a Trumbull painting itself. Two exceptional marriages there on that platform as well. They're devoted to each other, the Bushes and the Reagans. And of course, that's at the core of their political philosophy as well, the strength of the family. Hard work. Notice the president's son-in-law, Dennis Lavelle, brought his own camera, for example, and was taking pictures in there, so there's a kind of family outing about it. Something to be said for it. And we were told that they would only have 400 in there, John. Somehow they managed to squeeze in 1,000. There are a lot of folks in there, like Bill Buckley, who's an old friend of the president's, who's there. Holmes Tuttle from California. Jimmy Stewart is there. Wives of members of the cabinet, like Mrs. Smith, the wife, Jean Smith, who's the wife of the Attorney General. Mrs. Weinberger, the wife of the Defense Secretary. Roger Mudd at the Rotunda.
Vice President George Bush has just come over to shake hands with John Stennis, who was specially recognized by the president. As you reported, he'd had his leg amputated several months ago, now on the way to recovery now. So Vice President Bush, Mrs. Bush, President, and Mrs. Reagan on the way out, waving to a crowd that has now jumped up on the various pieces of statuary in the hall. The speech was had a more intimate quality than it would have had out on the West Front, and when the president began, it was almost in a subdued tone. He got his biggest explosion of applause when he called for a constitutional amendment that would mandate a balanced budget. At least the biggest burst of applause came from the Republican side.
Yeah, that's a tough one, though, don't you think, Roger, to get that through?
I think it's tough. It's easy to applaud, but tough to... easy to applaud, probably a little tougher to vote for, and I think almost impossible to clear the Congress. The president laid out 4 or 5 broad themes. One, a freeze on defense spending, or on the whole budgetary outlook. Also, the promise, he said, of total elimination of nuclear weapons one day. When you say one day, that puts an open-ended commitment. That's a good applause line and a worthy goal as he approaches this last term. Now, I suppose the most striking phrase of the speech was a sentence toward the end when he was trying to impress his audience at how rapidly things moved and how much progress had been made. He said, "The world is lit by lightning. We are unable," he said, "to keep up with the speed of things." So we are now in the middle of a swirling rotunda here with the Marine Corps band playing harmonious music. Lots of handshaking, lots of backslapping. The governors are here. The new members of the Senate are here. The tall ones you can spot. On one side you have the new senator from West Virginia, Senator Rockefeller. Next to him, Lowell Weicker. And close by is the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, Mr. Volcker. You have 3 starting...
Well, we may have lost Roger. This has been patched up for everybody in a hurry here. We could not get a camera to him because these are pool arrangements of the 3 networks are showing many of these cameras. And he is just inside the rotunda. We didn't know whether we would even get to hear from him. We'll be back with more coverage of all of this on NBC. John Chancellor, Tom Brokaw, the fully assembled NBC News team, including Roger Mudd and others. We'll be back, as I say, after this.
(1897). William McKinley was the first president-elect to be protected by a Secret Service man, a single bodyguard who escorted him on a brief trip from his hotel to the White House to begin McKinley's inaugural.
Congressional luncheon, so-called. There you can see Statuary Hall. There have been some other Americans invited to this as well. We'll be talking about them later on. This is a very select group of people, of course, who have been invited here for a 3-course luncheon, and I always wonder why they go to such great difficulty. We have hot mousse of sole, sautéed spinach, medallions of veal, glazed vegetables, wild rice and chestnuts, a cold praline souffle, California wine, of course, California Cabernet and California Chardonnay, California Champagne.
It's not exactly macaroni and cheese.
No,
Tom.
it isn't exactly, and I can't imagine that they eat more than maybe a forkful of each course, if that much at all, but it is part of the tradition, of course, that we go through, and it's something that reaches back to French history rather than American history.
There are, the President will probably respond to Senator Mathias's toast at the end, and it was interesting how 4 years is a long time ago. And we cast our minds back to 1980 and remember what it was then. The President said the following at the end of the lunch at the 1981 luncheon. He said, "With thanks to Almighty God, I have been given a tagline, the get-off line everyone wants at the end of a toast or speech." And then the President said, "Some 30 minutes ago, the planes bearing our prisoners left Iranian airspace and now are free of Iran. We can all drink to this one."
Right. That was the beginning of the Reagan administration. In this speech, the most significant thing that he had to say, probably from a policy point of view, is that he's going to submit a budget, as a lot of people suspected that he might, that will call for a budgetary freeze or free spending at the current levels. If they really wanted to have a freeze on a day like today, they could appoint a bipartisan committee of some kind, take that huge budget document and stand outside for about 30 seconds, and that would freeze it in place, as a matter of fact. But that is the first clue from the President's mouth that this is what, in fact, he hopes that he'll be able to do, and they think that they can save, what is it, $50 billion by doing
Well,
that?
it's down to 50 now. It was 100 before. Let us remind our audience of what the President did again in the President's room of the Senate in 1981 after the previous inauguration. Mr. Reagan signed an executive order freezing federal hiring, he said, to control the growth of the federal government. Well, they have controlled the rate of increase of the federal government, but domestic spending in this country in 1980 was $400 billion. The estimate for 1985 is $575 billion. Military spending was $130 billion in 1980. It is estimated in 85 to be $245 billion. So controlling the growth of the federal government has been as difficult for Mr. Reagan as it has been for many presidents in the past. But his first act as president, up on the Hill in the Senate, in the President's room of the Senate, an executive order freezing federal hiring.
And as a matter of fact, the percentage of the federal government of the GNP has gone up under President Reagan as well. One of those who is watching all of this very carefully from his seat as the senior senator from the state of New York is Daniel Patrick Moynihan. He's at the Capitol now with Roger Mudd, and they're standing by. Roger's back at his post in Bob Dole's office. Roger, nice to see you again.
Thank you, Tom. Senator, you're the first Democrat I've talked to since the speech. In fact, you're the first politician since the speech. Just tell me what you thought of the speech, number one.
Well, I agreed with your term that it was subdued. The president was not quite up the way he almost always is for such occasions. Subdued a bit by the experience of his first term, which is going to dominate his second. The two basic facts, which is that public finances are in awful shape, and he knows it. He has to somehow get them under control, and they've gone out of control in his first term. The second is that we are at something of swords points with the Soviets. We do have to get our arms relationships under control. He is very deeply committed to the idea of building a shield against ballistic missiles.
The Star Wars?
Star Wars. He spoke about it with great conviction. He would find most of us in the Senate are saying, but Chief, the cruise missile makes all that different. It changes everything. Warheads don't come in from outer space. They come in under the Brooklyn Bridge. So we'll have to watch that. But I took it to be a conciliatory speech, certainly not a partisan one.
Did it lay out a plan of action for you as a member of the opposition? Do you know what to expect?
Well, he said that
freeze.
he's going to freeze.
Right.
Does that mean he will freeze defense spending? I think he meant... I don't think he meant that. We can ask him. What he did say is, after 4 years of government, it is more complicated, isn't it?
That was his message that came through to you.
More complicated and a little bit less fun. But still, it was a It's his day, and we're all for him. We're proud of him, proud of Mrs. Reagan. I hope he doesn't have a cold. I think he might.
I was interested in a comment you made just a moment ago that you thought his subdued feeling was because of the weight of his first administration. I thought, reading the election returns, that his first administration was a success.
Yes, and its very success means establishes precisely what will be the problems for the second administration. How to deal with a public finance which spent us into a great prosperity, unquestionably, but can also crash. As he said 4 years ago, such deficits will bring ruin, and there never have been such deficits. And secondly, an arms build-up on both the Soviet and the American side that has to be brought to some resolution, which he means to do. There's nothing, this is history time for Ronald Reagan, and good. But meaning to do it and getting it done, he now knows are very different and difficult things.
Thank you, Senator. The phone is ringing. I've got to leave you and answer the phone. Thank you. Tom?
If Bob Dole is on the other end, Roger, you're going to have to give him his office back before the day is out, no doubt about that.
Somebody wanted coffee.
Right. By the way, the president in his speech about the budget freeze used this language: I will shortly submit a budget to the Congress aimed at freezing government program spending for the next year. Now, Cap Weinberger just last week was on Capitol Hill pleading for increases of 5.5% to 7% for the defense budget, and he feels strongly that it must go up some. So there is a good deal yet to resolve, not just on this day, but in the next 4 years, and a battle royal with Congress is expected. We'll be back with more continuing coverage of Inauguration 1985 right after this.
1909. William Howard Taft was Theodore Roosevelt's hand-picked successor. Later, Taft admitted that every time he heard someone say, Mr. President, he looked around for Roosevelt.
Again, of course, the two biggest stars are the president and the vice president, but in the case of this official family as well, Nancy Reagan is very much a major star in her own right. There's been a dispute down through the years about her political influence on the president, but we did hear Ed Rollins, one of the president's principal political advisors, saying a little while ago that she is a big influence. She is, after all, his best friend, and I can tell you personally, after covering the Reagans now for nearly 20 years, that Mrs. Reagan has a keen mind about what is best for her husband and does not hesitate to speak that mind in public and in private, more in private than in public. Well, Chris Wallace has been following Mrs. Reagan at close hand as well, and he's there on the White House lawn, as you can see. His ears are still intact and his nose hasn't fallen off. Chris?
No, but that may just be a matter of time, Tom. You know, as Ronald Reagan was sworn in today, his wife Nancy was standing beside him holding the Bible, and that was only fitting, because Mrs. Reagan has been next to her husband, helping him for the last 4 years, and in more ways than most people realize.
I can't imagine life without her.
The president paying tribute to his wife in a campaign film last year, and with good reason. Paying tribute to the glamorous First Lady who has helped him preside over state functions. Paying tribute to the best friend who clearly helps relieve some of the terrible pressure of his office. There is another less public link, however, that may be just as important. Mrs. Reagan's influence on the personnel and policy of this administration. Key advisor Mike Deaver has seen that influence.
If she thought there was somebody around that could help him, she'd push him. If she thought there was somebody around that would hurt him, she'd get involved.
And she'd have an impact?
Absolutely.
Top officials say Mrs. Reagan was instrumental in pushing Alexander Haig and William Clark out of the cabinet, in helping Deaver and James Baker gain control of the White House staff in the first term. She is generally sided with moderates over hardline conservatives, more interested in seeing her husband win than in ideology. This means she also has influence on policy. Angry about his image as a reckless cowboy, she was a key figure in getting the president to talk to the Soviets, wanting him to be seen instead as a peacemaker. All this usually happens behind the scenes. But last summer at the Reagan Ranch, the First Lady seemed to help her husband answer a question on U.S.-Soviet relations.
Doing everything we can. Doing everything we can.
Joseph Lash, biographer of Eleanor Roosevelt, thinks the First Lady has a key policy role: to be honest with the president when no one else will.
To have such a person built into the home, so to speak, who gives it to you straight, it can only be invaluable to the country as well as to the president.
Mrs. Reagan was not always so self-confident. During her first year in Washington, she seemed crushed by criticism of her expensive lifestyle. And then she was devastated by her husband's shooting. A year after the assassination attempt, there were still scars.
Every time he leaves the house, particularly to go on a trip, I think my heart stops till he gets back.
But the pain eased. Mrs. Reagan launched a campaign against teenage drug abuse. And eventually, she seemed to start enjoying herself again. By this summer, she was ready to take on an unusual role for a First Lady, addressing the Republican National Convention.
I drew on your strength many times, particularly the first year in the White House.
And then, as always, thinking about her partner.
Let's make it one more for the Gipper, and thank you.
For all her clout and her new willingness to be public about it, Mike Deaver says Mrs. Reagan's priorities haven't changed.
Does she have a sense of history and of wanting to leave her mark as a First Lady on history?
No, I don't think so. I really think that her principal interest is his mark on history. Her primary agenda is Ronald Reagan.
Pure and simple.
Pure and simple.
First and last.
First and last. Always.
Still, Mrs. Reagan's influence in the second term should be even greater than in the first, because with all of the president's old California friends leaving the White House, she'll be the only longtime advisor who's still there. Tom?
Chris, do you think that she'll take a more active public role in this next 4-year period in terms of drug abuse and the programs that she's interested in?
Well, absolutely. In fact, she has a big event planned this spring. She's invited First Ladies from all around the world to come to this country to meet with her here at the White House and then go down to a big conference on drug abuse down in Atlanta. And after the president's trip to Europe for the economic summit in May, she's talking about traveling around the world, taking her fight against drug abuse, not only to this country, but to countries all over.
That would be a big step out for her to do something quite like that, to go around the world on her own and talk about drug abuse or any policy.
No, I get the feeling that it really has been a continuum since the bad days of 1981. She is feeling more and more self-confident about her public role as a First Lady, both in terms of advising the president on policy, although I don't think she's going to go too far publicly on that, but much more so in terms of her role doing good works, especially drug abuse.
And yet there is this continuing controversy in the pages of some newspapers, at least, about how much money she spends on her lifestyle. The Washington Post, figured that she spent $46,000 on her wardrobe for this inaugural weekend. She said that was vastly overstated.
Well, I think they said that's what the average shopper would have spent. But, you know, Mrs. Reagan has a long-time relationship with some of those big designers, and I guess they may think it's pretty good publicity for her to be wearing their clothes sometime over the course of this weekend.
Chris?
Yes, sir.
When you're comparing the figures, you might remember that Mrs. Lincoln, Mary Lincoln, spent $27,000 on the fabrics for the gowns that she wore at the first inaugural.
And as they say, that was a different dollar then than it is today.
It was a sounder dollar in some ways than it is now.
John, this whole business about Mrs. Reagan and her role, and the First Ladies necessarily have become even more prominent, I suppose, in our consciousness. They've been prominent down through history, but because of this density of information that we're dealing with all the time, everything that moves in the White House gets a lot of coverage on television and so on. I find personally nothing wrong with a man having a wife that he can rely on for good judgment and in whose decisions he has some faith. I think that it's a...
Well, without trying to be sexist about it, I agree absolutely that they are a team, and I think they're a wonderful and inspiring marriage. I think it also helps to have a woman around the house. I think she can do things for a president that he cannot do for himself. And my favorite in all the world in this is Dolly Madison. You know, we hear a lot about Dolly Madison. Most people don't remember. Her husband, James Madison, was Jefferson's Secretary of State. Jefferson was a widower, so for 8 years, she was the hostess at the White House. Then her husband got to be president. That was another 8 years, and for 13 more years, she lived across the street. She holds the all-time record for influence.
There's Mrs. Reagan at her husband's right as she led him right around that end of the table, as a matter of fact. They're assembling in a statuary hall for the luncheon arranged by the Congressional Delegation Committee, the Congressional Arrangements Committee. That's Senator Charles Mathias arranging the chair for her there. This is where the luncheon will occur, and I don't think we're going to get to see a great deal of this unless they change the arrangements on this as well. other members of Congress, and 6 Americans who were drawn for the way they represent the cross-section of our lives. Mac Mathias from Maryland was called down to the White House last night to help with the rearrangements. Everyone had expected that today's ceremony would take place outside, but in fact, they had to quickly assemble in the rotunda.
You know, that's the room where the House used to meet before they got the new House chamber.
That's right.
Beautiful place.
And it wasn't all that long ago. I was when Ronald Reagan was a young man in his early 20s, for example, the Supreme Court would meet in the rotunda of the Capitol. Washington has changed a great deal over the last 50 years, a great deal over the last 20 years, for that matter. By the way, to bring you up to date on why all of this has changed on this day, it's now, John, pushing 7 degrees out there, getting absolutely tropical. The wind chill is merely 11 degrees below zero, so that's why things have changed in this capital city on inaugural day, 1985, January 21st.
And now it's by no means over. The president is going to see all those kids who came to play in the parade.
That's right, he's going up. We were just looking at Washington, if we can just see that once again. It's a pristine day in terms of the clarity of the air and the way the Capitol and the other memorials come out against this crisp winter day. Roger Mudd is safely inside, snug and warm, in Bob Dole's office, the hideaway in the Capitol, and he's there now with another senator who will be playing a key role in the deliberations in the years ahead. Roger?
Tom, this is Senator Simpson of Wyoming, and he's the newly elected Assistant Majority Leader of the United States Senate. Did you hear from the President today your marching orders for the coming session, sir?
It was a blend of get with it and this is your job, and it is. This is our job to handle this budget. It is not the President's job. It's going to be tough, anguishing. Lots of little sacred cows will be all corralled for the first time and slain inside the corral. It's going to be tough.
Who'll do the slaying, Senator?
Well, since I have been duly elected for 6 more years, they will let me use my bald pate as a lance, and I will go forward into the fray. But I don't want to take my friends over the cliff, and it is our job to do it. It's always funny to me how they talk about the President as a budgeteer. He's not. He's a toothless tiger on budgeteering.
But I'm perplexed by that description. Tell me what that means. He's a toothless tiger. I've never heard Ronald Reagan called a toothless tiger.
Well, he's like a governor.
Yeah.
Governors right now are sitting in legislative bodies all hunkered down because there's nothing they can do. The legislature is going to lay it on them or take it away or give it to them.
But he's got a budget he's going to send up here in a month, doesn't he?
Sure, but he has no ability to control that budget.
No influence with you guys?
He's got the influence, but he has no ability to control it. The votes that do it are ours. That's the Congress's role. And so the presidents and the governors, they have budget offices. They stand for the role of the budget executive, chief executive officers, but they, in a sense, are toothless tigers.
The other day, Don Reagan said that they thought the approximate total of cuts would be about $50 billion, and he wasn't sure that the mix that the White House sends to the Senate and to the House will be to your liking. What do you think about the process? Do you think the White House is going to be able to carve out exactly what it wants, or is it going to have to give a lot more on defense, for instance?
I really say, quite honestly, that defense must give. We may actually have to dispose of systems. We may have to do that.
You're kidding?
Oh, yes.
Whole systems?
Yes. How do you get to the money? The rest of it's nickels and dimes.
But how do senators vote for a budget that penalizes them back home, for instance, in their systems in Pascagoula, Mississippi, for instance?
When you hear chaps like Barry Goldwater saying that you're going to have to maybe get rid of bases, then you want to know you've seen the moon from both sides. You know, that's the way that this is the way it's going to be, this trip.
Well, I'll come up here every day and watch the corralling of the sacred cows. Thank you.
There'll be blood and hair and eyeballs all over the floor.
Blood, hair, and eyeballs, Tom. Senator Simpson's prediction for the first session of the Senate.
There's a way with words, Roger. A toothless tiger, blood, hair, and eyeballs. I'll tell you. It's
okay.
He's on his way off to do battle. That's the first. Well, that may be throwing down the gauntlet to the president. We were talking earlier about whether, in fact, he was going to be a lame duck. Now he's a toothless tiger. I mean, it's not starting off the second term.
That's the biggest signal as you're going to get when Alan Simpson, who is very conservative, says we're going to talk about reducing whole defense systems.
Right. They've got to knock him out because they've authorized him, but they don't have the money to pay for him, called appropriations. We'll have more from Washington on Inauguration Day 1985 on NBC, but first a station break.
(1913). After his inaugural, Woodrow Wilson reviewed the West Point cadets who marched in his inaugural parade. One of those cadets was a young man named Dwight David Haynes.
Good afternoon. Once again, I'm Tom Brokaw here with John Chancellor as NBC News continues its coverage of Inauguration Day 1980.